morning. I think we've got just about everybody here. I know Councillor Blackburn is away, traveling back to the city this morning, and so he'll be joining us later this afternoon. But welcome everyone else to the Council Committee of the Whole 2018 budget deliberations. This council's first opportunity to consider a budget for the city of Grande Prairie. And that's all I'm going to do for introductory remarks, and I'll hand it over to our CEO, Bob Nicklay. Bob.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and it is my first time for budget as well. So several of the council members around the table, this is your first time through, at least as this council, first time through a budget. And I really appreciate the opportunity to spend a few days with you and put 2018 in some context, and then actually propose a 2018 scenario or two or three, as it turns out, for your deliberation and consideration. I'll turn attention first to the budget report that you would have received in your agenda package. I won't go through it in any kind of detail because I'll assume people have had a chance to read that now. But I think what's most important is that at the conclusion of these budget deliberations over the next few days, management is hoping that we can get to a point where we will be able to adopt a budget for 2018. Operating budget is important that we get it done before the end of the year, so you've got a little bit of time, but we're hoping that we've put together sufficient material and sufficient elaboration on that material that you can get comfortable during this week in approving an operating budget. We'll also be advancing a capital budget that is a combination of the approved four-year capital plan that we would have received from the previous council and referrals that come to us as the years go on, in this case 2017, from the various standing committees. So we will also be looking at the conclusion of these discussions to approve a capital budget for 2018. So we've got a bunch of work to do in order to make that happen. You were provided material in advance, but there'll be an abundance of material that you'll find in your binders today, and we're going to go through in some detail over the next couple of days. Throughout everybody's presentation, I can't speak for the folks from outside the organization, but throughout everyone's presentation on the management side, I will encourage council to go ahead and interrupt if there's something through the chair. If there's something that you want us to elaborate on at that time, go ahead and stop us. We'll elaborate as best we can or set it aside until we can be more fulsome in our description of it, rather than waiting for all of the questions at the end. There will be an opportunity at the end of every session for a more robust Q&A and discussion, if that's the way we want to go. But in the meantime, just don't hold back, and we'll move with it. Still regarding the mail-out package, what I was hoping, or what your management team was hoping, is that there were essentially three things that should have jumped off the pages for you as you went through your preparation material for today. The first is perhaps stating the obvious, and we'll probably say it too many times this morning, but 2018 is the fourth year of a four-year budget process. It was set by the previous council, and this is what is commonly referred to in Grande Prairie as a mini budget, during which refinements take place in order to get the budget in place for the coming year. And in that regard, the material that you see today for 2018 could be described as generally faithful to the previously established priorities, from the previous council, and offering us a stable platform in which we can move from 2017 to 2018. The second thing that I'm hoping jumps off the page for you is this idea of incorporating scenario budgeting. This is the very first time in Grande Prairie that we've used scenario budgeting to this extent. We start with a base. We actually start with the first reference to a budget is the arithmetic extrapolation of the budget that would have been set 4 years ago, which leaves us in the fourth year, and you'll start to see some numbers around this as we get into the presentation, but that's a pure arithmetic extrapolation of the 2015 to now commencing 2018 budget year. And that's where management starts. From there, we move to what we refer to as a base budget. And the base budget is management's managed attempt to take that initial arithmetic extrapolation of the budget that manifested from the four-year planning cycle and putting it into a context in which we've managed to the best of our ability within the priorities that were set by the previous council. And then we move to the two new scenarios that council directed several months ago, which is to look at a base budget moving to 3%. So if we're imagining if we had a maximum of 3% tax rate increase in order to support revenue requirements, what would a budget look like? And the fourth scenario then is if you had no tax rate increase at all and you're facing 2018, what would a budget look like if you couldn't alter your revenue at all from year to year? So those are the scenarios. They were adopted, or they were embraced, I'm going to say, quite enthusiastically by the management team and almost without exception throughout the organization. Not because because they were not considered to be intellectual exercises, they were considered to be planning exercises that reflect things that could really happen. So when we move from the arithmetic extrapolation to the base budget, we need to cut $2 million out of the budget in order to get there. So that first step, just going from what the 4-year budget left us with to what is being proposed to you as a base budget, took a $2 million net revenue requirement cut in order to get there. $2 million intellectually is a lot of money. $2 million is two major taxpayers in Grande Prairie. So we have two taxpayers that I could name that are $1 million taxpayers in this city. If something happened that we lost those two taxpayers, this would no longer be an academic exercise. This would be an exercise of us having to come to grips with the fact that we lost $2 million off the top line. So planning exercises like this in the scenario budgeting context are considered very valuable by your management team, and we hope that that's the way it reflects for council as well. The third thing we're hoping jumps off the page for you, and I apologize that you're going to hear things like PBB over and over and over again, but the third issue we hope jumps off the page is simply that the future ain't what it used to be. We are looking very, very intensely at fundamental changes to how we do our short-term financial planning and control, and how that planning and control reports and interacts with City Council. This year, it is manifesting for the first time in 2018, or pardon me, 2019 will manifest for the very first time in what's referred to as priority-based budgeting. And we're going to take a little time this morning and get into that in some detail because it's important. Many of you have only been here a month, so to look at taking a $164 million budget and approve it, get intimate with it, get knowledgeable with it, and move through it and approve it in a month is a pretty big ask. We are going to ask you to do that, but we're going to make a sincere promise to you that by the time you're going through an exercise like this again, it will be at a much different level, a much stronger base, a much more robust way of looking at short-term financial planning. Priority-based budgeting will take us there. There are also some fundamental changes inside the organization that will be reflected in our interactions with City Council as we go forward. Things like lean business process improvement techniques. We have already started to train yellow belt and green belt lean individuals. And we've also started to train right up to the black belt Six Sigma level for things like the canola field to key business processes that are involved in land development throughout Grande Prairie. So very, very fundamental changes in terms of how we will interact with council and how the organization will run starting in 2018. These are ambitious undertakings, but they will be done. You'll also hear us reference project management, and there's a slide where we talk about some of these new initiatives. I just want to flag that when we talk about improving project management in the city of Grande Prairie, we are not being pejorative about the project management that has been done in the past. In fact, in the examination that I've done on the achievements of this community, even in the short time that I've been here, over the past 10 years, project management must have been done very well because on some very limited resources, some pretty incredible things got achieved in Grande Prairie. But throughout the organization, we want to focus on a more disciplined and rigorous approach to project management. There are some skill sets that are involved in project management that lend themselves to virtually everything we do, and we want to make sure that we're all on a solid platform with that. And the last thing I'll just mention then in terms of prep is that starting in February of this year, we will take 4 days of your time again. We will close the doors and sit down and roll up our sleeves and work on a council strategic plan that will be your direction. So just as you are inheriting the strategic priorities and the fourth year of a 4-year budget cycle from previous council, you will be asked to set a 4-year window and longer in many of the cases where we're looking at capital plans. You will be asked to set that strategic direction for us going forward. And that's a very purposeful exercise. We've already started to work on how that should be structured to make sure you get ample opportunity to think strategically and have that manifest into a strategic plan for 2019 to 22. So with that, Mr. Mayor, I thought I would just do a brief review of the agenda. I have been approached by a couple of council members who have asked respectfully that we expedite the delivery and deliberation of this budget wherever practicable. So people who are making these kinds of requests, we're very careful to make sure that they are expressing that they're available and interested and capable of full set deliberation. So nobody's trying to shortcut this in any way. But if we've got a coffee break we don't need to take, if we've got a lunch break we can work through, this agenda is flexible enough that we will work through those coffee breaks, we'll work through those lunch breaks, and perhaps get us out a little earlier if that's council's preference. There's only one hard date in here, or one hard time slot in here. The rest of them are pretty flexible. So we'll start off this morning with a macro view of the economic forecast. It has been a bit of a roller coaster in Canada, even in global markets, and we're certainly seeing that manifest in Alberta these days. That has a profound impact on what's going on in the province and in the country, and CIBC Wood Gundy will take us through an economic forecast presentation. We'll then move that down to a more local and regional level, and Brian Glavin will come in and go through an economic forecast, economic profile that starts to reflect some of the intimate knowledge that Brian has on exactly what's going on in the community, what's happening with our oil and gas sector, what's happening with our agricultural and forestry sector, what's happening with regional retail, etc. So Brian will take us through that to put us in a frame of mind that allows us to look at 2018 constructively. Just so that it isn't left unsaid, Brian also reached out to the Chamber of Commerce and I believe to UDI. UDI may be joining him this morning. I'm not 100% certain, but both of those organizations were invited to attend as well. If they don't actually attend this morning, their views were certainly solicited and have been incorporated into Brian's views wherever possible. So we're trying to broaden our reach into the community when we talk about what's going on in Grande Prairie and in the region. Scheduled after that then is a lunch break, and we'll move into a brief discussion on priority-based budgeting. And at 1:30, this is our one hard time slot. This is a webcast presentation that's being done by a company called Resource X. Resource X is the company that makes priority-based budgeting happen. And they're going to do a presentation that takes you through what you can expect in future budget cycles so that you'll have something to contrast this mini budget to as you go through much more detailed short-term financial planning. Another break scheduled then to give people a chance to catch up on emails. And then I'll spend the afternoon going through the presentation that you would have found in your binders. An early version of it was mailed out yesterday, so you would have a chance to at least thumb through it. But it'll take us through a recap of the strategy that we're working from and some of the budget accomplishments. And one of the fundamental messages in going through strategy again and looking at the budget accomplishments that occurred during the strategy period, 2015 to 2017, is to demonstrate just how profound the impact of strategy is on what this organization does on an annual basis. So what you set as your strategy in the offsite in February will manifest over the years to come into specific accomplishments. So we go through a bit of an inventory as to what those accomplishments were. We talk about a couple of tools, citizen budget process. There's also a tool called the name is escaping me, the service level reviews, base service level reviews that we'll go through in some detail. That's a bit in response to several council members asking whether we currently have KPIs. Do we use KPIs? Do we use comparisons to other municipalities and comparisons to previous years when we talk about the performance of our service areas? The short answer is yes, we do, but they're not typically as incorporated into the budgeting process as they will be when we adopt priority-based budgeting and start to integrate base service level reviews with the presentation of service plans in priority-based budgeting. Then we'll go through the operating budget in its various scenarios and the capital budget, which will include both the approved capital plan from 4 years prior, the recommended capital plan, the referred items that have come through City Council, and then there are a couple of items that came through committees and council that management was not able to recommend in this final budget. We'll highlight what those are when we've changed anything that council's directed us to do. We'll highlight what those are, and those will become part of a strategic discussion that we'll have on the third day. So we'll make sure that there's lots of discussion on anything that has come out of those. That'll conclude day one. So that'll take us up to the end of today. Day two will allow us to drop to another level of detail. So when I speak to you this afternoon through my budget presentation, will be at a relatively high level. The numbers will hold as you walk all the way through the detailed presentations that will come, but mine will be at a higher level. Day two will start to have the directors come in front of you from each of the divisions and talk at a much more detailed level about what these various service levels at base, 3% and 0 mean and how they would achieve them. The marching orders on the budgeting scenarios was that every scenario that's brought forward to City Council needs to be a scenario that we could in fact execute on. So you won't hear anything like we're going to fight every second fire in order to save money. That's not a practical option, and so it's not in here. Anything that has been presented to you as a budget scenario is something that if council directs it, we will do. Each one of the directors will take you through that, starting with infrastructure and protective services, moving to community living, then to city manager and corporate services. Susan will take us through both of those. And then we'll conclude day two. Day three is, I guess, what can best be described as a day of deliberation. We'll spend a little time talking about these strategic issues that have been set aside that we need to talk about more fully. But generally, day three is a day that's set aside to allow you to hash out the specifics of the things that you heard and hopefully focus in on what you'd like to see happen in 2018. If that can coalesce to the point that we get a motion on the floor to approve a budget as amended, presumably, for the operating and capital year 2018, that would be delightful. We will take that. If that occurs, we'll take that forward, and that'll become the budget basis for 2018. So that, Mr. Chairman, is the agenda for the next couple of days. Lots of flexibility, lots of ability to talk about other issues. What I will encourage, if you will tolerate, is try not to get down to too granular a level, in part because this is a mini budget review. The more granular activity or the more granular analysis does occur in priority-based budgeting for sure, and typically in the cycling through Grande Prairie, it occurs in the first year of the 4-year budget cycle. So if I respond by citing that we're dropping down to a level of detail that's more operational than we should probably be discussing around this table, please tolerate that. You don't have to acquiesce to it. We can talk at whatever level of detail council insists, but I will try to encourage us to stay at a more policy and strategic level so that we can get the roadmap in place for 2017 day by day throughout, or 2018, pardon me, day by day throughout 2018. We will be executing on that, and there'll be lots and lots of time for us to redirect. So with that, Mr. Chairman, I'm going to turn the floor over to CIBC Wood Gundy, ask that the gentlemen introduce themselves and take us through their presentation.
Gentlemen, welcome. I was was just going to say something about your microphones, and I didn't turn mine on. So if you can just, since we are webcasting, just try to make sure whoever's speaking has one sort of pointing roughly towards their mouth. It doesn't have to be right up close or anything like that. But welcome to the City of Grande Prairie.
Thank you. So good morning, Mayor and Council. My name is James Hobson. I'm an investment manager and portfolio manager for the City of Grande Prairie's short and long-term investment reserves.
My name is Todd Poland, and I'm also portfolio manager for the City of Grande Prairie on the long-term short-term reserves as well.
Yeah, and Charter Hall investment advisor, work with the team, again, with the city's portfolio as well.
So we really appreciate you giving us the opportunity to provide an investment and economic update this morning. The goal, really, we want to keep it sort of open, so feel free to ask questions as we go along. The goal of our presentation is to not put you to sleep before all of your budget decisions. We really want to try and add some value here and give you some added confidence when making those strategic budget decisions. So I'll go through a brief agenda here. We're going to start out with the Canadian economy. We'll start with sort of a more Alberta-focused provincial outlook. I'll hand it over to Chart to talk about oil. Obviously, that has a huge impact on things here in Grande Prairie and the province as a whole. We'll give you kind of an update on where inflation, interest rates, and the Canadian dollar are and where we think they're heading. Then we're going to kind of switch gears and talk about sort of Canada-U.S. trade relations. That's a big topic at the current time, how that's going to impact us, what we see coming. We'll give you an update on U.S. growth as it does impact us here in Canada, and then just sort of a key themes for 2018. So again, feel free to interrupt with any questions along the way. So we'll start out here with just sort of the broad Alberta overview. So this is a much more rosy presentation than we've been giving the past couple of years. So essentially the worst of the oil shock is behind us. So the chart on the left there shows you just Alberta's real GDP. These are the hard growth numbers for the province. And you can see in 2015, 2016, just the magnitude of the drawdown in growth. And it almost sort of parallels that in what you can see back in the financial crisis of 2009. So, you know, severe downturn, as we all know. But the good news is we think the worst is behind us. The growth numbers here are returning to the positive. But the issue is that we're just kind of clawing ourselves back out of the hole. So when I say we're leading the country for provincial growth, certainly that's a good thing, but it's going to take some time to really flow through. On the capital investment side, that's the right chart. You can see sort of in 2015, 2016, how severe the drawdown in capital was, mostly from business-related spending. 2015, almost 30% drop in business capital spending, and a similar drop in 2016. Again, the good news is those numbers have turned positive, and we expect them to continue in the green, so to speak, for the next couple of years. Switching gears, looking at how sort of Alberta stacks up against the rest of the country, the good news is Alberta is projected to lead all, among the top performers of all provinces for the foreseeable future into 2019. So real GDP growth, we're getting to near the end of the year. We forecast at 3.3% in real terms. And again, sort of slowing down, but still at a fast clip of 2.3% next year. That's still above the national growth rate forecast at 2.1. So, the growth story has been more broad-based. Retail sales have been very strong. That's been helping us a lot. And again, some oil capital spending is starting to come back. One of the issues that many of the municipal clients we work with have been raising is just this issue of net interprovincial migration. So this is basically people leaving Alberta to pursue jobs in other provinces, as they dried up in Alberta. So the bottom left there shows you the employment. The blue line, there's the unemployment rate. So you can see it sort of spiked in 2016. The gray area is the forecast. So, we think we've seen the worst. We are seeing unemployment rates start to come down across the province in the different regions. And we expect that'll continue, for the next sort of 3-5 years at least. On the right side there, it just shows you the population. We've had 8 consecutive quarters of people leaving the province to pursue work elsewhere. So again, the gray's the forecast. You can see that the good news here is that we think that the worst is kind of, we've seen the worst, and that people will start coming back to Alberta as the jobs come back to Alberta. So on the whole, as as the oil market recovers, and I'm going to pass it off to Chart now to talk more about that, we expect people to come back to the province, and we'll see sort of a brighter next few years.
With oil, the biggest question we always get is where do we see oil kind of coming in the next 2, 3, 4, 5-year mark, and we'll get to that a little bit at the end. And the biggest thing I like to discuss, the biggest thing I like to discuss is first starting with kind of where have we been, and then we kind of go into where we're going to see. And sure, nobody really needs a reminder, but from the $27 bottom we saw in the price of oil, it's kind of the market has spent significant amount of time trying to find new sustainable levels. And what it's actually started to happen is after it hit that $27 bottom, the market's slowly starting to push back up into is what we call range markets of like $10 swings up and down, which from a market standpoint is actually a lot better for Canada because we're used to those boom bust cycles, right? So the fact that the market's trying to find a sustainable growth market now is actually a lot better for even commodities as a whole for us. So that's kind of where we've been. I think today the price of oil is trading at $55.20, just from 55 and change. So the biggest thing here is I'll break it down in 2 different ways. I go supply and then demand, and then in each factor we kind of go North America and then across the pond our OPEC friends, or what they're kind of doing. So those 2 big battles are what's going to affect the price of oil and the bottom line. So on this side of the pond, Canada, rig counts. Rig counts, you'll hear about it in the news every day. Rig counts are up. That's why oil's swinging all over the place. Our perspective, when you take a longer term forecast, rig counts going up is actually positive in our view for oil for one simple reason: capital spending, right? Producers are coming back into the provinces. They're starting to turn those oil wells back on. They wouldn't do that if their forecasts weren't long-term positive as well, right? So we've seen rig counts, again, from the bottom of $27 start to pick back up. Year-to-date rig counts for Alberta, 142, up 86%. That's all relative. When you fall down to $27, every dollar swing is make a big percentage change. But on the average, on the whole, we're actually starting to see supply slowly start to come back up rather than just kind of a big flood the market kind of situation is what caused the crash in the first place. And then the other big thing for capital spending on this side of the pond is land sales, right? So we saw land sales, the price of land sales and actual land sales kind of fall off last year. And producers and new production, they've started to actually drive the price back up and buy significant more land sales. 2 big things, land sales coming back to Alberta and Saskatchewan for production and future growth. So not just rig counts of old wells being turned back on, it's trying to buy new land to develop new markets. And where that market here is Duvernay. The Duvernay asset play has been the biggest focus for a lot of oil and gas professionals in Alberta. It's talked about as the next Montney or shale kind of boom for Alberta, right? So that's the big thing for us here. So capital spending increasing in Alberta and production is slowly starting to drip back online for Alberta. Down south into the U.S., really quickly, obviously the production shortfall, and I don't want to say shortfall, but the lowest inventories we've seen in a while in 2016, it's obviously started to come back up since then. What you're looking at the chart down there is by area. Where is it coming back up? Overall, all the trends are the exact same as oil finds a new market here. The recent shock from the hurricanes that we had down south did cause a little bit of, it did help the oil inventory because when they couldn't bring in more, they had to shed what they already had in inventory. So that was kind of led to help in supply. So from a supply standpoint in North America, we still have ample supply, but in our mind, that's not necessarily a bad thing because it's new production, new capital spending that's coming back to the provinces here. And then again, across the pond, our OPEC members. With supply, there's 2 different approaches, and I'll get into the geopolitical conflict first of all. You'll rarely find a time in OPEC where geopolitical conflict isn't an issue, but what we have right now is kind of you've never seen tension this high from so many different areas in the same point in time. Really quickly, Saudi Arabia and Iran, the vocabulary and language they're using, the rhetoric is at an all-time high, but the actual probability of war is very low, but the market doesn't like to have uncertainty in anything, right? So the rhetoric that's coming out of there is really high. The anti-corruption committee in Saudi Arabia is actually doing something for the first time in a long time. They've targeted $100 billion in money that they want to try and find, and they've made it very clear no one is safe. They went after princes and like prominent businessmen right out of the gate, which again panicked the market, and that's why you saw a little bit of a swing on that side of the market as well. Iraq, you have the civil conflict in Kurdistan going on, further disruptions to supply. Venezuela, whose their GDP, largest percentage of GDP is predominantly oil. Everybody knows they've been hurting for a really long time, and this is the first time they've come out and said they're looking to refinance, restructure all debt. Well, they haven't given any specifics. And again, that's really a lot of uncertainty for the markets, causing a lot of panic on the OPEC production side. And then last but not least, the Nigerian rebel groups ending the ceasefire. They've basically come out and said they're going to resume attacks. Just to give you guys a little bit of idea on the impact of this, the last time they were actually specifically targeting the Nigerian wells and doing the attacks on them, it was $7 billion in impact to Nigeria alone, let alone the OPEC members. So the ceasefire is actually, it hasn't started yet, but when they start bombing, it'll impact the production that we're seeing coming out of the east there. And then again, the promise cut that we saw back in November 30th in the OPEC members, when they first had that promise cut, the biggest concern for all of us and the globe was, is there going to be any cheating? There's no enforcement of that tool. Everybody just promised that they were going to cut, and we just kind of sit back and hope they kind of do it. But from all the forecasts, the good news is all the OPEC members have been honoring this cut. Why that's really good for us is that means OPEC and non-OPEC is on the same page that they want to see sustainable price growth. They don't want to see the $27 or $100 oil and the shocks back and forth in the market. They want to see what we want to see, and that's sustainable growth, because they want to be able to forecast and bring in long-term sustainable revenue. And then again, so that's supply, demand. Demand, where is that going? Emerging markets, there you're going to be your biggest demand growth for total oil demand for across the globe. Out here in the West, it's going to stay flat to maybe a little bit positive as the market starts to turn around. We will see that, but emerging markets, as they've been depressed for quite a long time, now they're starting to turn back up. They're going to lead to your biggest pull towards the total oil demand. And what that means for the market is, in terms of total inventory, supply versus demand, you actually see a balance where we've always had too much supply for the last couple of years. The market's seeing a balance in mid-2018. So mid-2018 is kind of that inflection point where you should see large amounts of production start to come off the market, which is really good for us. And then, so putting it all together, essentially, supply, ample amounts of supply in North America, capital spending on the rise, which increased supply. On the other side of the border, OPEC is doing production cuts, and there's geopolitical risk that's going to affect the price of oil and affect the supply. And in terms of demand, demand's increasing. So it's kind of it's always going to be that push and pull, but on the average, demand is beating supply. It's going to it's going to continue that way. And where if you guys force me to put a number, where do I think the price of oil is going to go? I personally think it's going to keep going the way it's been going. It's trading in these range pockets as the market continues to push it higher and higher. And we want to see what's sustainable and what the market wants and what market sees. And you've already see it priced in. Everything that I've said is that supply balance. You can see it in the market. They've priced that mid-2018 balance. So I still think we trade in these $10 ranges where you go 55 to 65, 60 to 70. You say these range pockets until the market finds its new sustainable norm, and then a long, drawn horizontal portion for there. And I will pass it off to Todd to talk to you guys a little bit about Canada.
Okay, well, I'm going to chat a little bit about Canada and just give you sort of a broad overview of what's really going on. And, you know, we've seen something happen in the last year that we haven't seen in a long time. The Bank of Canada is raising interest rates. And that's been the first time since Mark Carney did it back in 2010. If you remember when Mark Carney did it back in 2010, we were coming out of the Great Recession or the Great collapse of 2008, 2009. And they were the first G7 country to raise interest rates. And at the time, everyone was criticizing, going, you know, what are you doing? Like, we're still kind of in the weeds. Why are you raising interest rates? And he had a few increases only to give them back just a few years later. And we came right back to the ultimate low levels that we're at today. What we've seen now, I think, I didn't believe it back in 2010 that we'd seen a real bottom in interest rates. I thought it was somewhat premature. And the argument has always been, well, did Mark Carney raise interest rates to build a little bit of padding so that if we run into some more trouble down the road, he had some ability to cut? Because remember, we're at basically ultra low levels, there's not much room left for the Bank of Canada to cut. And that was always the argument. Did he buy some time for the Bank of Canada? We don't buy that argument. In fact, we think he was doing what he thought was actually prudent at the time. That argument's akin to, let's say if you were having a heart attack and you needed to take an ambulance to the hospital and it was going to take you 10 minutes. That's akin to you, for the first 5 minutes of that drive, telling the ambulance driver to do 20 kilometers less than the speed limit, only so that you can spend the last 5 minutes to go 20 kilometers over the speed limit. It just doesn't make sense. We think he was doing what he thought was prudent at the time. It didn't turn out to be what was necessary. But long story short, what is happening now, we think, is a secular trend. And we're seeing the beginning of something that we haven't seen for the last almost 40 years. We think interest rates are bottomed or have bottomed, and we're in the process of seeing that. Now, that being said, growth in Canada for the first half of the year, fantastic. It averaged around 4%. We haven't seen 4% growth in a long time. Where did that come from? Well, it was a little bit spotty. It was very regional, geographic. It wasn't across the board. We had it in, it was certainly hotter in some areas than others, and a lot of that growth came from areas like BC and Ontario, very hot housing markets, things like that. A cheap Canadian dollar also helps the exporters in Ontario and the manufacturers in Quebec as well. And BC has that engine that they're driven, where they have a massive film and television production business that's also driven by a cheap Canadian dollar. So we've had these engines that these provinces have had that have not been dictated by commodities. So they've managed to keep growing. We've also had 2 years in 2015 and 2016 of very, very underperformance in growth, very sort of lagging growth behind the rest of the world. So we've had a bit of a bounce back. We've had a bit of a catch up. Now, remember, this isn't pure, our economy didn't grow, 4%. This is year over year change. So we're still, technically getting back to where we should be if we were at a normal growth rate the whole time. And we've lagged the last couple of years. So that bounce back, what we're starting to see, the first half of the year looked great. It's starting to moderate. And we're starting to see that the GDP is actually slowing down. And we think that moderation is actually going to continue. Because of that, I don't think you're going to see the Bank of Canada, this is our own 2 cents, obviously, but I think they will start to, as well as growth moderates, they're going to slow down on their pace of raising interest rates. And I don't think that you're going to see that happen, at least until 2018. There was another chance they could do it by the end of the year, and I don't think you're going to see that happen. But we've seen 11 consecutive monthly increases in employment up to last month, which is unbelievable, and part of why that growth rate was so strong. That is also starting to moderate. Now, in Canada, we just getting back to the October 25th rate decision. After 2 consecutive 25 basis point hikes in July and September, the Bank of Canada left rates unchanged. This is for a couple reasons. Governor Pelosi came out and he stressed that we're still not seeing some of the measures that, or the indicators that he'd like to see in order to really have the rates continue to come up. And one of them is lack of wage growth. Wage growth, or when you're actually seeing people's wages go up, that's happening in the United States. And wage growth is typically the last sort of piece of the puzzle of a sustainable growth economy. When people are getting paid more, or when it's harder to find good quality labor, so you're offering higher money to attract staff, that's sort of top of the market. That is a very, that's a mature market. That's a sort of a growing economy. We're not quite there. The United States is actually at that point. Their economy is a little bit ahead of ours, and they are seeing that wage growth. We are not. That's a big component of inflation, and without that, I don't think you're going to see meaningful interest rate increases for a while. That is something that we could see the gap close next year, but at this point, it's not there. So I think that limits what he's going to want to do. As well, he knows that we've got a housing bubble in 2 big markets. It's been talked about for 2 years now. The Office of the Superintendent of Financial Institutions is tightening mortgage regulations so that at the same time, he doesn't want to choke off the consumer, so to speak. Everyone, about 2/3 of Canadians has gone to variable rate mortgages, floating rate mortgages. So you're sensitive to that increase, and you're sensitive to that automatic increase that is brought on by each 25 basis point hike. So let's just say back in 2007, when the Government of Canada bonds were 6%, they could move rates by a point, and that was about a 20% swing. Well, if you've got a variable rate mortgage and you're paying 2.5% and the bank rate moves a point, you got a big change in your cash flow on a monthly basis. And if you're close to the margins, you're operating sort of on a cash or a check-to-check basis like the paper tells us a lot of Canadians are, well, I'll tell you, that's a big squeeze. The Bank of Canada knows this, so they're going to tread a very fine line. I don't think you're going to see rates come up. And in fact, we've talked about this ad nauseum, but the law of averages tells us that we've had a 40-year period of interest rates coming down. We don't think they automatically go back up. We think the trend is over, but we think we're going to spend the next 5 or 10 years in what we call a basing trend, where we generally go sideways and the new trend starts to develop. I think there's a good chance in a couple of years we're going to have another recession where the rates come back down again. So it's not an uphill, it's not straight an uphill battle. So I do think that there's a few things that will keep this a little bit mitigated. I also think the economic environment in Canada is being affected by the political environment in Canada right now, both on a provincial and a federal level. Now, there's not a lot that we can do to quantify this, but we know that there's been billions and billions of dollars that has left both the country and the province in the last couple of years with changes in the political and taxation environment in Canada. Now, the problem is, I'd like to sit here and tell you that money has a heart, that money likes to do the right thing. It doesn't. Money likes to go where it pays the lowest tax, and that's really it. Right now, that's not Alberta, and that doesn't happen to be Canada. So with the pressure of that, we don't know how much money has gone, but that money that's left these jurisdictions, we're going to need that to come back to see some growth, and we're going to need taxes to come down to attract it back. The problem is when money leaves, it usually doesn't come back for several years. It's not a quarter-to-quarter decision. So we've lost money, and it's going to take us a while to come back, and that is a bit of a worry. Now, our correlation with our dollar, our correlation with oil prices, it's the lowest we've seen in almost 3 years, which is kind of interesting. So that's usually we see the dollar move around with oil almost lockstep. It's starting to disassociate a little bit. So we've got a few more things that are driving the dollar, which is a good thing. We personally believe that the Bank of Canada has goalposts, and their own game plan is that they want the dollar between 70 and 80 cents. We think that's their range. They'd like to see it optimally right in the middle of that range. And reason why? At around 75 cents, we're very attractive in terms of manufacturing to sell our goods elsewhere. Anything lower than that, when we get around 70 cents, or back to when oil was at 27 bucks there for a whole day, our dollar was at 67.5 cents. When we get that low, many of you remember going to buy cauliflower at the grocery store, remembering how ridiculous it was, because we're importing all of that, and our dollar's worth so little, it becomes a drag. So the Bank of Canada doesn't like a cheap dollar that cheap because we're such an importing country. There has to be a sweet spot, and we think it's right in the 70s. We just saw our dollar at 82 cents. The Bank of Canada didn't like that. They came out and they essentially talked it down, didn't they? They said they weren't going to raise interest rates, and our dollar got hammered and went back down to the high 70s. The Canadian dollar gets pushed around a lot on the global market. It is a tiny dollar on the global scale of things, and speculators can move that thing around very quickly, as was seen a couple weeks ago. But we do think that you should use those goalposts as kind of where you think the Bank of Canada is and what they're going to do. They don't really like it up above 80 cents. They don't want it too much below 70. So right now it's in a pretty comfortable range. Now the housing market, this is interesting. I was able to say this last year, but we've never seen a housing bubble pop in history anywhere without interest rates going up. So I had questions last year from clients going, what about this housing bubble? I was in New York last year. I had Americans asking me how they could short the Canadian banks for this impending, housing bubble. They wanted to make money on this thing. Didn't happen. No housing bubbles ever popped without interest rates going up. Well, rates have now gone up. So we're in that territory that we could have a potential pop. I don't think that we were in that frothy market that was reminiscent of 2007 in the United States. We're not giving ninja mortgages. Those are no assets, no income, no jobs, that kind of thing. Where you're a 25-year-old with a pulse and you get a $500,000 house. That's not the case in Canada. We actually have the lowest default rate on mortgages of any developed nation in the world. That's pretty impressive. Canadians like to pay their bills. But we do know that house prices in a few markets are stretched. Alberta's not one of them. I would argue that part of the Vancouver story, we all know it, a lot of it's foreign money. It doesn't have to take a lot of foreign money because the balance is so tight. 10% 10% is all the extra demand that foreign buyers have put on that market, and that's all it takes to push it into frothy levels because the supply demand is so tight. That market, I don't think, the reason being is money's leaving China for the reason that they've clamped down on the fact you can only own one property. Well, that money's going to go elsewhere. Where does it go? It goes to somewhere that has a safe banking haven, and somewhere they can do business in the local. They can do business in the local language. Well, you can find a lawyer, you can find an accountant, you can find a real estate agent that speaks Mandarin, and the banks are very safe. Vancouver attracts a lot of Chinese capital, and I don't think that's gonna change. We saw them come up with, as you can see on the chart here, the foreign buyers tax to kind of eliminate that. Yeah, it did cool off the market, but then it stabilized. And once that uncertainty was removed, it actually started to come back a little bit. I think you're going to see something similar in Ontario. Ontario is driven a little bit differently, believe it or not. It's less foreign buyers, it's less speculation. The Greater Toronto Area, the GTA, has had massive population growth in the last few years. People just moving from Sudbury to Toronto. And that's what's driving this. And those are sustainable, for the most part, moves. Now, that will cool off. But this isn't something this is speculation driven. So it will cool off. It's not going to pop. That's my 2 cents anyway. Now, we've got a mountain of debt, and this is what the Bank of Canada is worried about. We've all seen the charts in the Globe and Mail and the media about how much debt we all have on a per capita basis. But if you look, back in the 50s and 60s, it's not a really comparable ratio. There was no home lines of credit back then. Visas were pretty few and far between. They weren't like they are now. You had to pay the balance at the end of the month. Now you can roll it indefinitely. Credit is part of our life. So I don't think we ever get back to the old low levels that we've seen back decades ago, but we are at pretty frothy levels. And I do think we need to pull back from what we are at, what we're at now. In 2007, as I said, when the Government of Canada bonds were 6% and interest rates move a point, that wasn't a big deal. But right now, with interest rates this low, every quarter point increase is a 10% move. That's a big deal. And so this is the sensitivity that the Bank of Canada is worried about. And this right here tells me we're not going to have interest rates go up in a very material fashion for a while, because they would materially push us into a recession that we would not get out of for a while. So this is kind of gives us a bit of confidence that rates aren't going to come up materially. Now, small businesses, which are a big piece of the economy, and in fact, a big piece of the rural economy, particularly, small businesses make up about a third of the economy overall in terms of GDP. They tend to be companies that provide sticky jobs. They're also a lot of the sort of the meat and potatoes, a lot of the rural communities. They're starting to show some fatigue. And this is a worrisome trend. For the first time in a long time, for the first time in 9 years, larger corporations are materially outpacing the hiring that small companies are making now. They're starting to see the squeeze. Now, I know that the government's kind of waffled on taxation of small businesses and corporations, and we don't know what's going to go on there, but I'll tell you, the uncertainty is not a good thing. The uncertainty is not a good thing. That's caused issues, but things like the minimum wage hike. Now, anyone who says that this minimum wage hike is a really good idea is quick to point out there's a very widely held study out there that says this is a good idea. And it was one of the proponents that was used to make the case here in Alberta and in Ontario. And it's where, I believe it was Australia or New Zealand, one of the two, they did this a number of years ago. And they instituted a large minimum wage hike. They did it in a much more materially measured and drawn out fashion. And in fact, the increase was much less than what we're going to do. We're in uncharted territory. Ontario's in uncharted territory. This is a big deal. If you were a restaurant in Calgary that was operating on the margin, Calgary taxes have gone up in the last couple of years, and you just had to pay your staff a lot more. You're probably out of business. And in Calgary, we've seen most of the restaurants turn over. Those are small business. That's meat and potatoes. There's a lot of people that rely on stuff like that. And at the end of the day, it's not the corporate salaries. It's a third of the economy. It's a big piece. So we're worried about that. And last piece here before I pass it back off to James. One of the things that I wanted to mention, this is kind of our forecast, and you can kind of see where we think interest rates are going to go. I don't think they're coming up materially fast. But what I do want to point out, we think inflation's coming back. And one of the things with inflation, it'll take time for it to really work its way in, but I'll tell you, when it comes around, it'll surprise the heck out of all of us, because that's what inflation does. It's not something you see coming. It's there. And when it comes, it's near impossible to get rid of. So that is also something that when inflation does start to rear its head, which we do think will happen, Bank of Canada is going to have to start to deal with that. And the punch bowl is going to get taken away from the party here a little bit, and rates will come up. So what a balancing act. I would not want to be in Mr. Pelosi's shoes here in the next couple of years, given the fact that, the consumer's not looking very healthy. At the same time, the fact is that inflation's coming up and the rates have been too low for too long. So I'll pass that off to James.
Looks like our computer just shut off.
Right here. There we go. No.
Should we just proceed?
Sure, yeah, absolutely. Well, maybe just an opportunity. Are there any questions at this point for the presenters? If council members, if you have them, ring in. I'll give you a chance to see if we can get your computer reset again too. Councillor Platt.
Thanks, guys, for the presentation so far. It's nice to see some graphs heading in the right direction for a while here. That's pretty seeing them go the right way. I guess my question just more about natural gas. We spoke a lot about oil. This is a pretty heavy natural gas area, a lot of liquid-rich gas. Is there any comments around that, just to kind of get us where you think that's heading the next little while?
Speak to that a little bit here. With the natural gas, it's again, sorry I didn't go too much detail there, but that Duvernay asset play that I was talking about, that's a large portion of where the natural gas asset is coming from as well. So that essentially that asset play in that pocket is where everybody's kind of focused in, and gas along with crude kind of have the same forecast, I would say, going forward. And there's a lot more seasonality in the price of gas and all that kind of stuff, with especially with the partners down south. And a little bit hard to forecast, but at the same time, I would say that a lot of capital spending is coming back to the right areas for the natural gas as well. You're seeing existing production coming back online, and at the same time, again, with that Duvernay, it's the type of oil that's coming out of there is a lot of the light end and then natural gas kind of product as well. So they're kind of moving in lockstep right now, is what I would say. Yeah.
I would add to that longer term, I do think that Chart's correct that there is recovery in that market. However, I have a hard time wrapping my head around the idea that we're ever going to see the glory days of $12 per MCF again. And the reason I say that, unless we're exporting gas where markets are willing to pay that, we're essentially trapped in an island here, and everyone knows that story. But as the prices go higher, the marginal cost of bringing shale gas out of the United States right now is about $55, the break even. So if we go to 60, those wells take 3 months to get in the field and turn on to start pumping more gas. And just because that there is such a massive amount of that stuff trapped and the break even is 55, how far above can we go for too long before a flood comes on? And so we are going to get some spikes. I'm not saying that we're never going to get a spike that may get us to that point, but I just don't think it lasts for very long. So I think the metrics are getting better, but going forward, I think it's the days of double digits are long gone, I think. Good question.
Okay. Councillor Minhas.
Thank you very much for the presentation you guys given. The question you had a little bit touch for the loophole tax on the end, and that is affecting already, but now the government is buffering. So what kind of effect will happen in this? Either they do it or they don't, which is they're backing off. How they're going to do it, it's just really uncertainty. What you guys predicting on it?
Well, the funny thing, we have a saying that federal politicians have never made us a penny in my 20 years of the job, and I don't expect anything's going to get positive out of this. But I do think that, yeah, they are waffling on it. It's the uncertainty that keeps people away. If you were to raise the tax, get it done, rip the Band-Aid off, people can accommodate for that. It's the uncertainty that keeps capital on the sidelines, which bothers me. But I think what they failed to look at, and I'll give you an example, my accountant. My accountant runs his own accounting company out of his house. He's been doing this for 25 years. Nice guy. His PC is his retirement. His company is his retirement fund. Yeah. He's grown it in his company his entire time. Now that is going to be taxed at a different rate when he takes it out, because he's essentially going to be penalized because it's been kept in his company. That's his retirement. He has no RSP. His company is his retirement. His retirement just got cut in half. So people like him are, who aren't using loopholes, are getting thrown into the, so I don't know if anything comes out of this, but at the end of the day, it's probably going to take them 6 months of more uncertainty. And I don't think anything, it's negative for small businesses as a whole. Good question.
Thanks, Councilman Huss. Gentlemen, I appreciate that this is intended to be sort of Canada, like a high order Canada-wide and then Alberta-wide. But do you have any sense, some of the population growth that you're forecasting, Grande Prairie's always trended above sort of Alberta forecasts, and we tend to be historically a bit higher. My sense is that the labor market has already tightened here to numbers that are much lower than many other places in Alberta. So are there risks of a economic dissonance where you have these other factors that are trending slightly differently in other areas than maybe in pockets like in our region? What would the impact of that be if we had a tight labor market here and so things are on the upswing, yet we still have that very low interest rate environment across the country? Can you extrapolate that at all?
It's kind of what's happening on a Canadian scale right now. We've got pockets that are operating very well and some that are not, and I think you're probably going to see some of that where decisions are made on a large basis that are not as necessary in the best interest for everybody. I think that's what that leads to. I think that's a good environment for you if we can continue. If you're the sort of the shining light, so to speak, and you have the growth in an environment that in a sea of lesser growth, that's obviously an ideal environment for you. But if you're on the opposite of that, if you're on the opposite end of that, yeah, I think you're going to see a drain of capital or a drain of people. And I think you would, being on the opposite end of that, are going to be in a good position to hopefully attract that and take advantage of that.
So if that's the case, yeah, then our region potentially would be a net benefactor from an inflow of capital because it'd be a more attractive place than others.
I believe so.
Councillor O'Toole.
Thank you very much. We've got the topic of coal in the province and the banning of the use of it in the next few years is going to affect a number of towns and villages and people. And we've seen that. So what's your forecast on the future of coal in this country, actually?
It's negative, but I can't sit there. I'll get James to comment on this as well, but I'm not happy at all where this is going, and I'm all for the cleaner technology, but imposing the carbon tax and sort of the deadline and putting out a deadline for even the province here, we've basically put ourselves in a penalty box. In terms of capital and attracting capital, again, money doesn't care about. I'd love it if money cared about the environment and doing the right thing. It doesn't. It cares about paying the lowest tax. That's a tax. And I know that Fortis was one of the big operators here, coal-powered. I happen to know the president of Fortis. He specifically said that the Alberta decision on coal was the worst decision he's ever seen in his corporate life. And I actually think it's going to be very tough for us to meet that deadline. I think it's a bit pie in the sky. But I think if you look south of the border, where our biggest competitor is going the exact opposite way and essentially supporting that, I really think it puts us in a penalty box. I don't think it's good. I don't think much good can come about it. I'm fine with the slow phase out, but at the end of the day, I think that we're setting a bar too high, too fast, and it's going to cost us. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think Todd hit the nail on the head. As you mentioned, capital goes to where it's feels safest, where it can make the most money, where the the legislative environment is more clear. So I think, as with other energy industries such as coal and potentially oil and gas, anything carbon emitting will attract capital into the U.S. If they continue down the path that they're going, and we keep going with carbon tax plus other regulations.
So with all the talk of alternate future or fuel sources, the universities and the other areas that are trying to find a better and safer way to use coal, that technology is basically in Canada shot out the door, is what you're saying.
Well, and I look at the old SAF oil technology that they tried to run with, that the Germans used during the war, turning coal into oil. They've kicked that around for a long time. It's just not very clean. It works. It works well, but it's just one of the dirtiest fuels we can have. I think that you're right. The money. I see what you're saying. I would hope it goes the opposite. I would hope that, given that we've got a deadline and people are forced to say you've got to do something here, that actually forces money into making a change and forces capital investment that's been sitting on the sidelines. But we haven't seen that yet.
Thank you very much.
I'd even comment to your point on the technologies and a lot of research being done on it. I would say the government they're looking at those pilot projects really closely because they want to see something work as well, because they want to see if the coal industry can have something, that kind of green light that gives them that longevity with the proven track record. The government's all on board, but it's just it's hard to kind of develop that longer trend and with all the research. But the government is still looking at a lot of these pilot projects right now.
Okay, thank you.
Councillor Plott.
Thanks, Mayor Given. Earlier, I think you had mentioned just about the kind of the ratio of, when taxes go up, investment typically drops down. Is there some kind of a metric you can speak to on a city level? I know that's kind of a federal and a provincial level that, when investment deteriorates, when taxes change. In your guys' cases, have you noticed any direct comparison for municipalities when taxes are too high versus investment in that area?
I have one good example. It's not a local one, but it's a very good one. Last year when the price of oil collapsed, or a couple of years ago, obviously, about 6 months in, maybe not quite a year, about 6 months into the low price of oil, I watched an interview with the director of finance for Minot, North Dakota. And they had him on because Minot, North Dakota had the strongest growth rate of any city of its kind or of its size anywhere in the United States. And it's a very heavy, North Dakota is almost all, Bakken shale. It's all oil and gas. And they thought, well, how the heck are you offsetting, your state's growth rate is way down. You're getting crushed on commodity prices. How the heck have you been growing double digits? Says it was simple. We cut corporate taxes down to almost zero. And we've attracted more, and we set up initiatives with the local college for work placements for students to get jobs. So we've got this labor force, and they've been attracting IT companies, and just basically everybody who wants to set up a shop and not pay tax, and they're hiring, and they're so it was basically they had the direct correlation. They basically cut tax to almost nothing, and they offset the growth rate completely. I've got lots of examples where if you raise tax, you lose it. But I don't have many that there's just nobody likes to cut taxes. It's kind of ugly. Boy, that's a lot of revenue to give up. You've got to. It's a real leap of faith. But I thought that was a really good example.
Sorry, Councillor Plott, I just think context might be important there, and we do have a relatively new council. Can you clarify what tax rate it was that they cut? Was it their property tax rate, or did they have other taxing tools that Canadian municipalities don't have access to?
No, the specific tax, I don't know. It would have been just a local specific business related direct. I don't know what the actual tax was, but it was directly just specifically operating. Yeah.
Potentially like a corporate tax or
it would have been
income tax or something like that,
operating
which Canadian municipalities don't have access to.
Yeah.
Okay. Councillor Plott?
Okay, sorry. Thanks for the clarification there. I guess my other, you kind of touched on it earlier. I'd say Grande Prairie is probably a little bit higher than a third small business. We have a lot of small business community in Grande Prairie that has been a big core of how we've grown. Can you speak to what you feel of what's going to happen with that sector's growth with the minimum wage that you kind of touched on, but also the utility rates? And I'm trying to keep it at a Grande Prairie level for a little bit here if we can, but just if that's possible for you guys, but just to look at if you're projecting a potential growth in small business in a local area with the factors of minimum wage and utility rates rising, of how should we be concerned, a little bit concerned, very concerned, what's your guys' thoughts on that?
Take that one. I think a little bit concerned would be the short answer. It's really it'll take some time for the small businesses to readjust to the higher interest rates. The good news is they've probably already seen that sort of shock to their confidence. So small business confidence is going to drive their decisions to hire and expand. So to the extent that the Bank of Canada goes slow on the rate increases, which we expect they will, we should see that small business optimism pick back up. So that's on the pro side. On the con side, minimum wage, it is, it's a complete experiment. Our chief economist came out in Toronto a month ago, and he was saying, yeah, we don't have any examples of minimum wage going up that far that fast. So it'll be really interesting to see how they adjust to it. I think it'll be the service industries. They may hire less servers, right, and have more go to the bar and pay for your food. But yeah, I think sort of cautiously optimistic is the outlook there.
I also think it's a case where it's the ability of them to pass that cost on, because that's what's going to happen, is that those costs are going to increase for them. They're going to pass that on to you and I. So the cost of a beer and the cost of whatever's going to go up, can they do that successfully? And in an environment like Grande Prairie, where you've maybe got that growth, you maybe have that income growth, and you've got some people moving into town, that's probably a little bit more sustainable. So I wouldn't, that's that one temper, that one buffer that you would have against something like that, is that you've got that offset, and maybe there's the ability to pay some slightly higher prices. I think in areas that don't have that growth, I think you're going to see strip malls empty. I know that sounds pretty ugly, but that's what's happening already.
Councillor Bressie.
Gentlemen, I appreciate your presentation. As I'm looking at these projections and I'm looking at the interest rates, I'm looking at inflationary rates, it's looking like, well, let me back up a little bit. One of the big things we're going to be discussing as a council is our downtown project and significant borrowing attached to that, and kind of the timing of that. Do we do it now? Do we do it in a year? Do we do it in a few years? And as I'm looking at these numbers, it's looking to me that now might be a good time to borrow, and that should maybe be a factor in a decision. But I was just hoping you guys would comment on that as well, as instead of me just looking at these numbers and assuming.
I think you're absolutely right. We're never going to be able to time it right on the short term, whether this year or 3 years from now is going to be lower, because I do think there's a chance we'll have another recession sometime in the next few years as part of this cycle, and we may get back to the levels we're at now again. But in the scope of things, yeah, you can't argue that we're, if you could lock something at these rates in for the next 20 or 30 years, I don't think there's any way that you'll lose on that. It's just such a long time frame erases all mistakes. And given that we're at a 40-year low and the lowest rates we've technically ever seen, you can't argue otherwise. And you know what? You may not see them go up materially, and you may not make as much savings as you expect, but you shouldn't hurt yourself. So I think you're probably not too far off on that.
Thanks, Councillor Bressie. And so, gentlemen, I realized that we sort of were in a bit of a break there while we were getting your computer reset. There was a couple comments that sort of might have led us to believe that that you're finished. I think you've still got another section to go.
There's a little bit more.
Great. Take it away.
Well, this is much more sort of big picture macro, so we'll kind of go through it a little bit quicker. But I think it's important, just given that this is creating a lot of noise, a lot of uncertainty for Canada as a whole. I think it should help to understand sort of what's happening here, how it might impact Alberta and Grande Prairie. So presentation wouldn't be complete without a nice photo of Trump, so we brought one for you. So Trump's comment is we lose big league with tremendous trade deficits with Canada. What's interesting about Trump's comments is you usually have to dive a little bit deeper to figure out what the truth actually is. So we brought the reality to go with his comment, and Canada, if you factor in services, we actually have a surplus of $7 billion. So I think where these negotiations in a nutshell are going to go is it's sort of all targeted towards Mexico, where they actually do have a trade deficit of $63 billion. It's more on the goods, less on the services. That's kind of the key there. And then in terms of how tough he's going to be, it is a lot of sort of, it depends on what political shows you watch, but it's a lot of political grandstanding versus actual, actionable items. So if this chart here just shows the states that supported Trump the most heavily in the election, the states that got him elected are the ones that would, they have the most to lose off of a NAFTA termination. So if he wants to get reelected, it would be a very, aggressive move to upset the largest sort of portion of your voters. So we think so actually it's interesting. The negotiations have been sort of in this impasse. Trump has big demands. Canada and Mexico essentially rejected him. They're actually in Mexico City today starting a 5th round of negotiations. So it's all in smaller things. The real big picture stuff will come out in early 2018. So there's going to be a little bit of uncertainty until then. But I was just reading this morning, if Trump he can't just decide to terminate NAFTA. He'd have to get NAFTA's legislation approved through Congress. And on top of that, the U.S. has never terminated a free trade agreement. So it would be sort of historic moment if he did that. And then let's say he did decide to terminate NAFTA and he got Congress's approval. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce and a lot of huge multinationals with a lot of clout and lobbying have come out and said they would come out in arms in full force to basically try and get that decision reversed. So we're not too worried about a complete reversal of NAFTA. And then if you look at a breakdown of Canada, we looked at sort of who has the most to lose from NAFTA renegotiations. Well, at the end of the day, it's not Canadians that have the most to lose, it's Mexico, as I already mentioned. But the studies that we look at show that Ontario has the most to lose, namely the auto export industry. That's been a huge sort of contentious debate. They want 50% of all autos to be made with U.S. components, which the auto industry basically said that's impossible. But that'll be interesting to see how that shakes out this week. But on the kind of top right there, it's got the breakdown by province. If you look at Alberta, it's kind of in the middle. It looks like we have a lot to lose from NAFTA, but that's all oil and gas. If you strip out the services, we're more on par with sort of BC, which has 16% of their economy tied to NAFTA. So in summary, we're not too concerned about Alberta's exposure to these trade renegotiations.
Sir, Councillor O'Toole, just if you would like to ask a question, turn your mic on and make sure that we can hear what it is you ask.
Yeah, what about the lumber industry with that 16% equivalency with BC there? So NAFTA goes done, where would we be at then?
They did increase the tariffs, I believe, to 21%. So it is a factor. But the lumber industry, if we look at Canada as a whole, is only around 1.5% of the GDP. So I guess speaking really broad terms, it's not that large of a hit, but absolutely it will impact province of BC for sure. Good question. I'll skip through this quickly. This is really just, this is what the contentious issues are right now. This is what they're debating this week in Mexico City. Dairy, much like lumber, is a relatively small chunk of the economy. And again, sort of focusing on Buy American, autos. I'd be more worried if we were sitting here in a Ontario municipality, because that is a concern for sure. So the Trump effect on Canada, the uncertainties created basically delays in capital spending, which is kind of a good thing if you think about it, because if this all kind of gets settled in early next year and there's not this big scary NAFTA uncertainty, companies can much more confidently deploy capital. So if there's money on the sidelines waiting to go to work but unsure about NAFTA, when those go away, all of a sudden that money gets put to work. So that's a good point. Much like Canada and the U.S., they are raising interest rates to kind of contain inflation. On those inflation metrics, we did show, and we actually had Bank of Canada come out last month and talk to us directly. They do see the inflation metrics starting to exceed their 2% target, sort of by mid to end of next year. So that should be on your radar for sure. And I'll go through one last slide and I'll turn it back to Todd. This is just to kind of give you a broad overview of where we are in this cycle. So this shows what's called the output gap, which is sort of where are we growing relative to where we could be growing if all resources were efficiently utilized. So you can see it's taken basically almost a decade to recover to sort of the mature phase of this cycle from the Great Recession. The good news is once we get to that mature phase, usually we stay there for a few years. It'll all depend on how the central banks respond to the inflation pressures. If they hike too much too fast, we'll see a recession, but we're hoping they kind of tap the brakes, they don't slam on the brakes. So this is US, but it also impacts Canada heavily. So I'll pass it over to Todd to wrap up on the US.
Yeah, and I'm going to wrap it up here with what I think is probably the key for what you should actually take away from this. And the reason being, excuse me, the Canadian market obviously has its own drivers, but we're largely pulled to and from by the U.S. economy. And so I really think that that's kind of the key to where we're going to go. The U.S. economy, when you strip it, all the noise aside, and you strip all the media, and it's never been louder than it has in the last year. When you get rid of all the crap, you look at the underlying economy, it's fundamentally in pretty good shape. And they've been in pretty good shape for a long time. The story here is that they've been growing around 3% a year for the last little while. It's a pretty sustainable 3%. And what we think is actually driving that is these millennials. It's the 25 to 35-year-old kids. That demographic has been expected to take over and be the purchasing power and be the push of that economy for the last 10 years. They haven't. And the reason being, if you look at the oldest kids in that demographic, the 35-year-olds, 10 years ago when they were just getting out of university, that was 2007. It was the top of the market. If they got a job for a year, they were lucky. They got laid off the very next year. And every year after that, the kids that got out of school couldn't get jobs for the better part of 10 years. What did they do? They kept working as baristas at Starbucks, and they didn't leave their parents' basement, right? And because they had student loans that were, $100,000 or $200,000 if you're, going to a big U.S. school. You've got a mortgage already without even owning a mortgage to pay off that student loan. So yeah, you're going to stay in your parents' basement. You're not going to buy your first house. You couldn't get that job. Well, that's happening. We can see those kids are getting the jobs. We can see it in the numbers. It's a trend that's coming around. It's been years in the making. They're buying their first homes. They've sucked up all the inventory, the over-inventory from the last housing bubble. They're building new homes again. We can see it in the numbers. This is a trend that we think has legs, probably another 10 years. It's been a slow one. These kids, all they've seen is their parents go through financial whammies. So they're a little bit nervous to spend money. They've got the best balance sheets of any generation that we've seen. They don't like to spend money. They live in their parents' basement for free. So that generation is the driver, and it's legit. And so that's what's going on. The Fed's also getting out and they're normalizing their balance sheet. They're not printing money anymore, and they are going to be starting to withdraw some of that liquidity from the market, which is a good thing. The punch bowl's been at the party for far too long, but the recovery in the short term, although we could see a market bump somewhere along the line, in our own 2 cents is that the U.S. stock market has had a pretty good run without a pullback. It's probably due for something on a healthy correction in terms of in the short term. But the long term, I wouldn't worry about it. We actually think that U.S. economy is in pretty good shape, and that's a good thing. This is a cool slide. It shows you kind of the U.S. consumer confidence. When the chart's in the red, the consumer's nervous about things. That's generally in and around recessions. When it's in the blue, those are periods of bull markets and really good runs of expansion in the U.S. economy. My point is here, look how long we've been in the red. And I mean, it's no surprise. We've been in pretty rough water for the last 10 years. Kind of for the last 15, really. We're finally just getting over the blue. But the key is here, when you see, this is a long-term trend. It goes back to 78. When we cross over into the period of blue, it's not generally something that lasts for 6 months. It lasts generally for a few years. I think we've got a couple more years of this before things turn again. And the best leading indicator we have, and it's the last one of the last charts I'm going to leave you with. This is the best leading indicator we have in our business, bar none. It's the yield curve. It shows you the price of government bonds on both sides of the border and what they're paying you today. The blue is U.S. Treasuries. Red is Canada government bonds. Just shows you every maturity from 1 year all the way out to 30 years, what they're paying you today. That's all the chart shows you. It's pretty simple. But what it actually shows you is the shape of the curve. And I'm not going to get into the technicals, but the shape of the curve is predictive of economic activity. And an inverted yield curve is predictive of a recession. This yield curve has predicted every recession in the last six decades, accurately, about 12 to 8 months before it's happened. Very, very cool. It is not predicting a recession. There's no recession in the cards. It's actually got growth on both sides of the border, which is, we think is we're confident with that. And just to show you, the markets really climb walls of worry, but I'm going to pass this over to James. It shows you the growth of $1 million over the last sort of give or take 10 years. And despite the fact you've had all these massive drawdowns and collapses, look what the market's done over the last while if you were an equity investor and you were just buy and hold.
Yeah, so this chart, we just wanted to illustrate kind of the importance of what we're already doing with the City of Grande Prairie. I think it's set up really optimally. We've got a long-term investment reserve and a short-term investment reserve for liquidity, sort of your sort of June to June inflows and outflows. If you look at the bottom dotted line, that shows you over the last, it's only 10 years, purchasing power, if you just left it in money market, which is an interest-bearing account, you lost almost 8% of your purchasing power. So it is a big deal, this inflation, and that's at very low rates of inflation over the last decade. So imagine if inflation rates do pick up more. We could be losing 2 to 2.5% of our purchasing power every year. So, you know, I think we're already on the right track here. We've got, you know, a good investment reserve that's invested in fixed income that's done really well. But it's important that we keep managing that and not holding too much cash because, again, I think inflation is going to be a concern. And then the last, one of the last slides we've got here, just to kind of highlight the stock market for a minute here. Despite all the noise in 2016, you know, if you told me at the start of last year when we were down -20, the worst start to a year on record in Canada, that, you know, there was going to be a surprise U.S. election, there was going to be OPEC negotiations that were uncertain, all this noise, and Brexit, which was one of the worst days of my life, you know, would we have had a 20% stock market run? I would have said, you know, you're crazy. But yeah, we were the best performing developed market last year in 2016. And but we've still lagged the U.S. U.S. is reaching new all-time highs. But the cool thing about Canada, Canada's the red line, is it's done what we call a technical breakout. So all that really means is that if you look back in 2014, it kind of peaked again in 2015, and then again in 2017 in February, but it couldn't break through that level. That's a strong resistance level. Lately, in the last month, it's broken right through that. So that's a positive for a positive sign overall for Canadian growth. It's showing confidence that you know, things are looking better, and again, a positive for our portfolio. And then just summarizing kind of everything, again, this is kind of more macro, but we think the central banks, Canada largely does follow the US, so that's why we focus on both. They're both growing at sort of 3% or more paces, which is fantastic. We expect the central banks to sort of tap the brakes lightly. They've done it a few times, and we think they're going to take a pause here. We might see one more quarter point hike into 2018, at least that's our forecast. And we'll have to see where inflation goes in terms of, as Todd mentioned, how fast they're going to have to hike after that. NAFTA uncertainty, I think it's a lot of noise, so don't stress about that too much. And as Char was talking, the oil market is looking like we're going to have a much more stable, range-bound, sort of almost like a ladder-type pricing environment where both OPEC and North American producers want to see a stable, sustainable rise in the price of oil. So again, very positive for Grande Prairie. And with that, we'll open up to any further questions.
Thanks very much, gentlemen. Council, any other questions? No? Mr. Nickley.
Just a quick question. We talked a lot about the supply side for oil and gas. There's a lot of focus in Canada now on trying to alter the demand side, industrial development, petrochemical development, conversion of gas-fired electricity generation to coal-fired to gas-fired. Do you have a view as to whether or not the demand curve for oil and gas in Canada is likely to shift as a result of those types of efforts?
So again, we didn't go into too much detail on the demand side, but when we were kind of saying North America and U.S. projected to be flat on the demand side, that's taking into account all that technology and focus of moving and trying to push that demand cycle a little bit as well. It's hard to kind of push the demand side of the market. It's easy to change the supply, but that's kind of already put into that forecast of it's this side of the border is going to stay a little bit flat.
It's an interesting, just to add to that comment, we have what's called in any new technology or any new disruptive technology, we have what's called the J curve. So initially you think a good example is driverless cars. Well, you've got, or no, I'm going to back up. A good example would be, let's say, just electric cars in general, just electric cars. Now, we don't really have them here in Canada, but if you go down to California, there's actually electric fuel stations. You can stop and fill your car with electricity all along the highway. Well, it sounds like eventually, if everyone in, let's say, 10 years from now is going to have an electric car, well, boy, demand for oil is going to almost disappear, or for fuel. But getting to that point, you're actually going to use considerably more. So to get to that point of efficiency in the future from here, you're actually going to go through several years of inefficiency. So, for example, what's Tesla doing right now? They're building plants. They're hiring more workers. Those workers are driving to work. They're still driving the old cars. They're still using the old technology. They're still using fuel. To get to that point, there's a massive, so I do think over the next few years, where actually the demand curve probably continues, despite the fact that there's these initiatives to wean ourselves off and use more clean fuel. I think the demand curve probably continues.
Okay, thanks, gentlemen. I don't see any other questions. Thanks very much for being here today. Thanks for your work in managing the City of Grande Prairie's portfolio. We appreciate that. Keep making us money. We'd appreciate that. And I think next up in our agenda, Council, we had a break. Maybe we can stand and stretch, and that'll give Mr. Glavin enough time to get oriented at the presenters table. So we'll take 5 minutes or so here. Everybody can take a washroom break. Mr. Glavin can get oriented and set up at the table, and we'll be back in about, we'll aim for just after 10:30, so literally 5 minutes. Okay.
Thank you.
Depending on where we go, I might need more of my Jesus.
Okay, everybody, we're back. I said, literally 10:30. Okay, it's 10:37. But that's pretty good for this group. We did not bad. So we'll call it back. Next up, we have our Manager of Economic Development, Mr. Brian Glavin, again to help provide some economic context for the 2018 budget and beyond, but maybe at a more Grande Prairie regional level. Brian.
Thanks, Mayor Given. So yes, I'll be talking a little bit more regionally and locally than our last presenters, who did a good job of kind of setting you guys up on what the macro and national level trends are looking like. So we'll get started with kind of some baseline statistics for Grande Prairie that a lot of you will be familiar with already. Obviously, our population, we had a recent census come out at a little over 63,000. Working with some of our data providers right now, we actually think we're probably somewhere closer to 66,000 by the end of this year for population, and a lot of that's holding up with some of the population trends that we're seeing and the growth we're seeing in the residential side. On the population growth, we have been outpacing national levels of growth by almost 3 times. At 2.8%, nationally is averaged about 1%, and Alberta comes in at about 2.2%. So by all major metrics, we're doing fairly well on the population side. And then on the household income side, we're also exceptionally high. We're about 50% higher than the national average and a little over 10% higher than the Alberta average for median household incomes. We're also one of the youngest cities in Canada. For cities with more than 10,000 people, there are few that come close to our level. We're almost a full 10 years younger than the national average and close to 5 years younger than the provincial average within Alberta, which gives us some unique population and unique challenges that we have. However, with this young population, we also have very affordable housing. So unlike areas in the U.S. and other areas in Canada that have been depressed with their labor markets having high unemployment and low wages, we've been fairly the opposite over the last 10 years. And even during the recession, we fared fairly well. As of last month, we're sitting at about $295,000 for the average resale value of a house in Grande Prairie. So that's not new construction. That is all homes that have been sold. New homes are a little bit closer to $380,000 for average sale price. A snapshot of where we are in Alberta as far as the size of the city. We're sitting in 7th. However, as I just said, with some of the numbers we've seen recently, where we think we're actually probably closer to number 5 in population right now. And we won't see that until our next census comes out, I think, next year. But when that does, I think we should have a positive increase in population. So looking at population, oftentimes we get asked every time there's a correction in oil prices, how Grande Prairie is fared. And there's some misperceptions out there, especially on the national level of how tightly tied we are to the commodity market. In 2015, I got a call from a investment bank out of Toronto asking me to substantiate a 20% drop in population in Grande Prairie after they saw they'd heard rumors, they'd saw the energy prices go down. So I'm happy to report that within our division, our census division here, we've never seen a year of negative population growth over the last 15 years. There's not a single one on record through a recession. We have seen interprovincial and intra-provincial migration have people leave the city, so we have seen people leave. However, we have a very strong natural population growth, and that's basically births minus deaths. We've continued to set records every single year over the last 15 years with increased births. So we have a fairly sustainable base of population. The migration that we do see, when we see people coming into the city interprovincially, largely that is in the age group of 20 to 35. Intraprovincially, which is people moving within the province or within divisions, we almost without exception see people leave this region to go elsewhere. Part of that is education based in that demographic. Largely that's the 20 to 25 that we see leave. And it skews to female that we believe are largely higher education. We believe there's another factor in there with respect to people taking jobs in Calgary and Edmonton as they progress through their careers.
Brian, sorry, before you leave that slide, and we sort of talked about interjecting as we went along. Can you just speak to the international migration that you see in 2015, 2016? That's the orange there. Looks pretty significant and looks like it's of growing significance to our region.
Sure. On the international, I can't give you a lot as far as the origination of where people are coming from. However, it is certainly a growing portion of population that we're seeing. The major sources or the major levers of population growth for us, though, are interprovincial and births. Those by far and away are the largest source of population increases for the city.
Sure. Thank you. Councillor Minhas.
Thank you, Brian. You gave an update. My question is that when you get international, you count those work permit guy or the visa on the as a student? They added in there, or the real people like proper immigration? Those.
Unfortunately, we don't get a lot of detail with the statistics. We get a very high level set of data that doesn't distinguish where they came from or what type of immigrant they are. So taking a look at the residential market here, this is showing back to 2010. Average price is the blue line that goes across. So you can see it corresponds with the economic conditions of the time. 2010 was a relatively slow year, coming off 2008-9 when commodity prices did see significant declines, and then we saw the trend back up through 2011 into 14. And then again, when commodity prices went down, it did follow the market with that. However, we didn't see near the decrease in the average home price in the last decline, as we didn't have as significant inventories of new homes and new lots on the market, which aided in supporting home prices. Right now, although we are seeing things stabilize, general consensus through speaking with a number of the different home builders and developers is that it is a bit of a challenge right now to get financing, not only at the retail buyer level, but also to build spec homes and to develop land. Although Grande Prairie is a brighter spot within Alberta, we do get lumped in with the greater Alberta market and the greater Canadian market, which is a challenge in that you have to overcome a number of obstacles when you're hearing the headwinds, and the majority of the data that you see nationally is Alberta level. It's not Grande Prairie level. It takes a lot of extra effort to try and convince a lender that Grande Prairie is a good market to put their capital to work in, which is something that we've been spending a lot more time lately trying to convince the lenders that there is a substantial difference here. So on the housing starts this year, as of October, we had 151. CMHC is predicting about 290 next year. That's predicated on oil prices and the lending environment at the time. If oil prices or oil and gas prices are able to sustain themselves at this level or within a range of this level, we should see increased confidence and increased pressures on buying next year with the capital budgets that we're seeing in the oil and gas industry, which I'm going to touch on a lot more later on in the presentation.
Mr. Nicolai.
Can you just clarify that? You're saying that CMHC's prediction of housing starts in Grande Prairie next year, 290 combined?
They're anticipating 290 to 330 next year. They're low and high scenarios, which would be up between 50 and I think 75% over this year.
And that's a blend of single family and multifamily?
That's correct.
Thank you.
Sorry, Councillor Minhas, you're going to have to turn on your microphone. This is webcast, so if you don't turn it on, all the people watching get is silence. So turn the microphone on and pull it a little bit towards you there.
So this when you're talking just the city part, not the county around.
That's correct. Those are city starts.
Thank you.
So moving on to building permits, this is a little bit of a messy chart, but it goes back 4 years into 2014. So the darkest bar on the right-hand side of each month is 2017. So far this year, every month but February, we've seen permits increase month over month. Largely, these are being driven by commercial building and commercial alteration permits. We're starting to see, we have seen a little bit of pickup on the residential side, but not substantially. Industrial has not had a strong year, although we are getting indications that next year should see some more new starts on the industrial side. So by and large, it's a relatively good news story. We've had a lot of conversations with a number of different commercial industrial tenants over the last number of months, and we think we should see building permits start to increase significantly in the spring and over this winter. So moving back, looking at the different household incomes across the country. So we selected a few different markets on the eastern part of the country, and then a few in Alberta and the western part of the country, just to give you guys a rough idea of the differentiation between Grande Prairie and other communities. As I said before, in Alberta, we're about 10% higher than the Alberta median income and close to 50% higher than the Canadian median household income, and you can see everything in between. And we really only have one contemporary in Western Canada, which is Fort St. John, which has similar levels of median household incomes. When you look at Southern Alberta and Medicine Hat and Lethbridge, they're in the low 70s for median household incomes. And when you start looking at the cost of housing in those markets, they're not substantially different than what they are in Grande Prairie. So when you're looking to buy a house, it's quite a bit cheaper on percentage terms in Grande Prairie than it is elsewhere.
I see Councillor Plott.
Thanks, Mayor Given. Just on that note, Brian, I think we've chatted about this in the past, but I don't know if there's a messaging piece that the city could do. But one of the things that always hits home to me is when we talk to people that Grande Prairie is not an affordable place to live. Yet we have one of the highest medium incomes and one of the lowest average house prices in Alberta. Calgary's last month was $454,000 was the average house price in Calgary. And so I don't know if, how we get in front of that a little bit more, I guess, Brian. I'm not sure if you got some thoughts, but I just feel like that's something, there's a misconception in our market locally that it's not an affordable place to live, and all the indicators show that it's just the opposite of that. So do you have anything to add to that, Brian? Or?
Yeah, there's actually a fairly significant study that comes out by the province of Alberta. It used to be every 2 years. It's been a little bit more sporadic of late. It's called the Alberta Spatial Price Survey. It's something we do report on in some of our marketing documents. But one of the key things that it does is that it takes, I think, 270 different things that people buy, and it includes the cost of housing, the cost of taxes, pretty much any you can think of that you need to live. And it uses Edmonton as a benchmark in the index. So Edmonton is 100, and then everything else is benchmarked off of that. When you benchmark Grande Prairie, we're about 2% more expensive to live than Edmonton. And that doesn't factor in income. So just the costs are about 2% higher. Our incomes are 10% higher than the Alberta average, 50% higher than the Canadian average. So when you look at the costs on a percentage of income, we're exceptionally affordable place to live, although the absolute numbers sometimes tell us very slightly different story, as it is only about 2% difference in costs.
Mr. City Manager?
Just add to that response for Councillor Plott. That is definitely something that we're concentrating on in the development of our strategic messaging, our strategic communications. We're seeing it as well as we try to recruit people into Grande Prairie. It's traditionally been a difficult place to recruit into. And in large part, when you talk to people about why they're declining, or talk to headhunters about why they're getting an expression of no interest, many, many times it's because the remote nature or the remote visibility of the community on a map connotes a high cost of living that people can't get their heads around. So that type of messaging is going to become increasingly important for us.
Mr. Glavin.
So moving into our labor force statistics, we used to have great labor force statistics, and I won't go into too much of a complaint with the Statistics Canada here, although we have come to agreement that they are going to be providing city-level data again within the next few weeks. So by this time next year, I should have great city data. I'm hoping before the end of the month I have great city data again. But for right now, we have what we have. which is essentially all of Western Alberta that we get lumped into for an unemployment rate. So right now, the unemployment rate's at about 5.8%. Historically, Grande Prairie has usually been 1 to 2% below the economic region, which is what we're looking at right now. So if we had Grande Prairie specific stats, I would expect it to be somewhere in the 3.8 to 4.8% for unemployment right now, which is starting to marry with a lot of the things we're hearing from industry right now and having a tough time sourcing labor, which is becoming an increasing problem. And we're starting to see a substantial uptick in flight traffic in and out of Grande Prairie to correspond with bringing workers to the region. So I won't spend a lot of time on this statistic, but this kind of speaks to the diversity of the labor force. And unfortunately, this is Western Alberta. This is not Grande Prairie specific. But when you look at where the concentration of labor is and what people do, our largest is forestry, fishing, mining, and oil and gas. So forestry and oil and gas would be far and away the biggest component of that, followed by trade, which is retail trade, which is all the different retail that we have here in Grande Prairie. Grande Prairie is one of the largest drivers of Western Alberta economic region. So these numbers do have some reflection of Grande Prairie. They're just not Grande Prairie specific. Followed by construction, healthcare, and accommodation and food services, which speak to the kind of the regional trading area that we serve, as these are in higher concentration here than they are in other areas. So looking at the vacancies in the different sectors of the economy here. So this is looking at different products we have with office, industrial, retail. And going back to the peak back in 2014 when we had the lowest vacancies to 2017, and this is all as of July. So this is a snapshot in time that we use to benchmark the city. So we've seen decreases largely year over year in many categories, specifically industrial has seen a lot of absorption in the Richmond Industrial Park. There's not been really one single key tenant in there. It's been a lot of smaller shops that have been absorbed. On the office side, there's only about 4 buildings that are causing us to have a significant increase in vacancy, and those are the Sterling Centre out on the west end. We have the Higson building on the south end across from Eastlink Centre, and then we had renovations that were going on in Windsor Court, which displaced some tenants in there for a period of time. However, a lot of that I expect to be washed away by this time next year. On the retail side, shopping centers, some of this is based on some new construction and vacancy, but Westgate East, or the Westgate Centre development, which is where Bed Bath & Beyond is, there's some vacancy in there in the new CRUs they built. Freestanding retail, so that's a place like Staples, for example. We've seen absorption in that area. Downtown retail has been relatively steady. And big box has also been steady. However, this is going to change next year with Sears and potentially wholesale sports buildings being included in those numbers. On a percentage basis, some of that could be offset with new development, as we are expecting a number of new developments to occur over the next 12 months.
Can I ask a question about this?
Of course, Councillor Bressing.
You know what our vacancy? Oh, sorry, I just saw it. Sorry, never mind.
Okay.
All right. So this map is a relatively conservative map of our trading area. And I say conservative in that we made the area small-ish to be credible, as we've had difficulty over the years convincing multinational retailers on the size of the Grande Prairie market. Oftentimes they go into a community and they're looking at a 20-minute drive time or a 30-minute drive time. And when you apply those metrics to Grande Prairie, they don't produce the metrics they're looking for. But the difference in Grande Prairie is that there's not a lot of options in northwestern Alberta, northeastern BC, or to a lesser extent the Northwest Territories to go shopping. And then if you need services, there's a good chance you're coming to Grande Prairie to get them, whether you have to drive 2 hours or not, let alone 20. So this gives you a sense of where people are coming from. We do know that we get people far beyond this this kind of delineation into the Northwest Territories. However, as we were using this tool to sell to other retailers, we chose to use a relatively small area. This consists of about 280,000 people.
Thanks very much, Brian. I've got 2 councillors in the queue. Councillor Friesen.
Thank you. This just goes back to the retail. I know there's a consideration for a healthy vacancy rate. Certainly in residential, is there a healthy vacancy rate in commercial and retail as well, or is that?
I don't know if any landlord would consider a vacancy healthy, but we like to have some choice so that we have, if we have a new tenant coming in here, that there's some place for them to go. So typically, a lot of people would say 5% would be roughly a healthy vacancy rate. I don't think there's a magic number, but you don't want 0. 0 is not a good place to be for attracting people to the city. You don't want 10 because landlords don't want to develop, or it's a more broader signal there that something's wrong.
Something very wrong. Thank you.
Councillor Palat.
Thank you. I think to Eunice's question there, I think 5% seems to be the number that most lenders kind of put on a pro forma anyways when they're looking at it. So it's probably a healthy number. I guess, Brian, I'm just kind of curious if you can speak on what the vacancy rate in Grande Prairie is as far as apartment rentals and then general vacancy for residential, and also hotel occupancy rates. It's just because they do play a big factor in projecting potentially residential starts, and kind of the heart of the city, which direction it's going, because those are kind of the first indicators of lots of economic development, or lag indicators as well.
Sure. So on the residential side, last year, CMHC is the only one who tracks the market formally. We have informal tracking that a number of people do, and the city also does some tracking on vacancy rates. But CMHC last October released their vacancy rate, which was about 20% at that time, which unfortunately was somewhat of a timing issue, that it came out at 20% and that there were a couple new buildings that had just come online that had not had the opportunity to lease out yet. So it wasn't a true measure of the market at that time. We think it'll be down substantially. Our numbers are probably going to be closer to the 8 to 10%, we think, this year. As a lot of that inventory has been absorbed. A lot of the new inventory out there has been getting absorbed a lot faster than the older inventory that hasn't seen reinvestment. So I think that'll push some people to reinvest in their properties over the next little bit, but we'll also start pushing people into be buyers. And I think we're starting to see that now that rental rates are starting to go up again.
And hotel?
The hotel occupancy, as of August, I think we are around 60% by all indications that we've had from hoteliers. We're probably getting closer to that high 60, 70% now. It depends on the night of the week. On the weekends, we tend to be slower, but during the week, if you searched Expedia right now, there's probably a number of hotels that are sold out for tonight. And that's been the case for the last number of weeks.
Brian, before you leave the retail trade area, I just had a thought arising in terms of risks to our local economy. That map that just showed our retail trade area, the west side across into the BC border, is obviously an important part of our local economy. And it just struck me that, was it retail trade as a part, did you have it in that sort of circle chart as a part of our contributor to employment labor force? So if that 12% of our labor force is focused on essentially retail sales, how big a risk factor would changes to provincial sales taxes be on our local economy? Has administration ever undertaken an analysis, or is that something that could be found out?
It's certainly something that could be found out. We haven't spent a lot of time on it. I would suggest that unless there was a substantial differentiation between the provincial tax rates, and it would have to be more than parity between the two, that people are still going to come to Grande Prairie for retail due to the critical mass and selection. If you're going to go to Walmart in Dawson Creek or in Fort St. John, you're still going to go to Walmart in Dawson Creek, Fort St. John, but you're not going to go to Costco, and it's highly unlikely a store like Costco or Bed Bath & Beyond or HomeSense is going to set up shop in one of those communities just due to their trading areas being low and not wanting to cannibalize their existing markets. So I think there is risk in that there's potential it decreases the frequency of trips, but I don't think it's something that would start to see us see a lot of leakage of stores into those other communities.
Thank you.
So just looking at the size of the retail market, these are a few headline statistics. These are almost 2 years old now, so there will be a little bit of growth. However, right now we see about $3.7 billion of retail spending in Grande Prairie every single year. About $532 million of that comes from outside the Grande Prairie region. There's about 4.06 million square feet of retail space. And to put that in perspective, a community of our side really only justifies about 1.8 to 2 million square feet of retail in the actual city. So there's more than double the amount of space that we need to service just the people of Grande Prairie, and that's very telling of the size of the market that Grande Prairie serves. At the time of the study, we had 958,000 square feet of retail demand that was residual. So that was calculated as demand or additional square footage that could be supported. That's a tricky number to put a lot of stock in the sense that, you know, it is subject to economic circumstances at the time. It's subject to differences in patterns of spending with consumers. However, in 2018, I think you're probably going to see 200 to 250,000 square feet of that number come off with new construction on the retail side that we're expecting to see come over the next few months. So it is coming. We expect to see more retail demand. However, it's changing. Things are looking different. You know, you had Best Buy and Future Shop last time. I think I was in front of council to have this discussion. You only have Best Buy now, and I think you're going to start to see smaller footprints, and that's a general trend across the retail spectrum. So the types of tenants like Sears out there, they don't exist in any significant quantity anymore. So those types of buildings, just like you saw the mall have to demise that space into a number of smaller spaces, that's likely going to be the trend you're going to see with any of the large spaces that become vacancies over the next little while. So one of the major stories that you'll all be familiar with here is the Grande Prairie Regional Hospital. But this hospital is a great economic tool for us, and it's a key piece to the quality of life. Not just in the sense that we have a nice new hospital, but it allows people to stay here for treatment and is a decision, part of the decision in staying in Grande Prairie versus moving to Edmonton or Calgary if you have a loved one that needs long-term treatment in a facility like this. So aside from the quality of life, this new facility with the new services that we're going to have, we did an economic study where we partnered with the Chamber of Commerce, the County of Grande Prairie, MD of Greenview, and a number of other stakeholders. In that study, we show about 507 new jobs that are going to be created by this hospital that don't exist today that we're going to have to recruit. Largely, those are highly technical and skilled positions that are going to be relatively high income, that are going to add to demand for the different services, whether it be retail, housing, or any of the other professional services within the community. But one of the major headline numbers here is the $276 million increase annually to the province's GDP that's going to be generated by this hospital, which is a huge figure. And I think we're all pretty excited to see that come online.
Mr. Lavin, I've got another question before we get too far. Councillor Platt.
Thank you. I guess my question, just one slide back, I guess, Brian, I don't know how we quantify it or if there's metrics out there we can start looking at. I'm just wondering what we think the Amazons of the world of how that's going to affect retail space moving forward, and if there's any way we can actually know how much of it's already happening within our city limits and how much, through mail or anything, if there's any way we can track or trace that. But if there's some think tank levels at a bigger picture that I know a few of us have had a conversation about what that could do to retail space moving forward. And I don't know if it's a major concern, little concern, where we're at with it, I guess.
I don't have any hard numbers to give you on that, but the kind of the anecdotal evidence would be things like Future Shop and then Best Buy's new formats being dramatically smaller in footprint than they are today. As far as what that looks like on the broader market long term, that's still somewhat of an unknown. Within industry, you have a player like Amazon right now that is, they have hundreds of billions of dollars in market cap and doesn't have to turn a profit to get it right now. That's a tough thing for retailers to compete with. So until that kind of shakes out, it's kind of new territory right now. I couldn't give you a great sense of where that's going. This is just a list of some of the services that'll be on the Grande Prairie Hospital here, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on that, and I'll move into the oil and gas sector. So the oil and gas sector in Grande Prairie has been a fairly positive story. Even during the recession, we saw quite a bit of investment. We're lucky in our geographic position here to be at the center of the Montney and right beside the Duvernay, two of the largest plays in North America and two of the only plays that are attracting attention from investors. This year, so I'll move on to the next slide. So this is a picture, this is a table of the top 8 producers that are Montney-focused producers. So these companies are producing in the Grande Prairie area, based out of the Grande Prairie area. And these are 2 of the line items they have on their budget, which is the drilling and the facilities expenditures. So between 2016 and 2017, we've seen a 158% increase in drilling budgets and a 73% increase in facilities budgets, which is dramatic. You can see it on the roads within Grande Prairie right now, which I'll cover a little bit further in this presentation. And although I didn't have a lot of space to fill this in with 2014 numbers, these are higher numbers than we saw in 2014 for both drilling and facilities investment. And 2014 was largely believed to be the peak of the boom, or of the last boom. So we're certainly seeing a significant return of confidence into the area with these budgets.
Mr. Nicolai.
Brian, if I can just interject, just given the context of this discussion as being 2018 budget, one of the things that we need to be prepared for as a municipality is this kind of development that's occurring in the community. Both the hospital with the 500 and some odd new people moving into the community and the new dynamics that facility will cause in the community, and this kind of radical increase in the pace of activity in the oil and gas sector nearby. So you'll see some of this manifest into budget discussions as we talk about planning and development, roads and engineering, recreational facilities, and even the consequential social issues that arise when we see this kind of activity.
Yeah, so I was hoping to have the forecast for 2018 from the different producers, although most of them aren't going to be delivering their budget forecasts until mid-November, which is more or less right now, but there's not much out there yet as far as what the capital budgets are looking like, although largely the indications are we're going to see the same or increased from most of the different producers out there. So for example, this year 7Gen was around 1.6 billion was their high end of what they thought they'd spend. They actually spent 1.65. So they pulled a little bit of money into that budget. Tourmaline, the second largest spender, is anticipating increasing their budget next year. They're one of the few that do have their capital out for next year, which will be close to a 10% increase that they're expecting to put out there. And we've seen similar guidance from a number of the other producers. So this is just another way we track activity in the oil and gas sector. So this is drilling licenses by oil or gas of the 2 types of commodities. And you can see the substantial uptick in the amount of licenses that are being pulled for oil this year, and a fairly significant increase on the gas side. All of that activity is within the Montney, by and large, in the Grande Prairie area. We don't pull the BC statistics. They're a little harder to get at than the Alberta ones, but we understand that they're also seeing significant increase in activity in the Fort St. John and Dawson areas. So this is the truth teller of the licenses. This is the completions data. So this is, you have from the time that you pull a license, you have 12 months to complete that. Our completions data is showing a significant increase in completions over last year. We're also up over 2015, and we expect a lot of those 2017 licenses that we showed in the last table, they'll start to be drilled over the coming months here. So we should start to see them being pulled into completions data shortly. And given that a lot of the budgets that I reviewed in advance of this are close to spending their entire 2017 budgets, I would suspect that most of those licenses will be drilled before the end of the year. And this kind of starts to substantiate our license and drilling data. This is over-dimensional vehicle traffic through the city. So these are permits that are tracked by the province that we then pull in through enforcement services. This year is the largest year on record for over-dimensional vehicles. So this includes things like rig moves, buildings or facility components that are moving through the facility. Essentially, anything that has a wide load or a pilot car with it is included in this statistic. So this is the traffic count.
Sorry, Brian, before you get too far away, Councillor Clayton, you just have to turn on your microphone.
In regards to over-dimensional vehicle traffic, do we have any indication if it's moving into the market or out of the market?
We don't get it directionally. And if you look at 2015, we had some big months in 2015 in the first quarter, which were, the way we understand it, over-dimensional vehicles coming back into the Grande Prairie, so pulling equipment out of the field and pulling it back into the yards. And right now, we understand it to be the opposite, in that this is equipment going into the field, and that's substantiated with the substantial increase in facilities budgets that we're seeing, the substantial increase in drilling activity.
And Councillor Palat.
Just on the, in light of that, we're, I don't know how many years away from maybe not having a provincial highway, like, excuse the bypass going through the city. Will these numbers be greatly changed once the bypass is no longer where there's a truck route outside of the city limits? And would we still be able to capture, because I think this is a great chart for us to capture how much traffic flow is. I'm just worried if we have a bypass that maybe we don't get the same picture at some point in time.
There's no risk of that happening right now. Once they cross the municipal boundary, they're required to report. So if they're within the municipality of Grande Prairie, it's my understanding that they have to report, and we get that data. So this is a traffic count. This is 3 kilometers south of 68th Avenue on Highway 40. This is just showing two-way traffic every day. So this is the monthly average daily traffic. So there's some days that are substantially higher, some days that are substantially lower. But for October of 2017, we've broken pretty much we've broken every record that we've had with traffic substantially. So in 2014, which was the previous record, we're 15% higher than we were then. And this goes back to showing just the amount of investment that we're seeing into the community, and that we've seen more investment this year than we've seen in 2014, which again was considered the peak of the last boom.
Ryan, I want to make sure that I clearly understand that number, because this is important as we get to advocacy with respect to Highway 40. So it's 1,400 trips per day, or two-way trips?
This is 1,400 trips per day. So this is direction and traffic in both directions. So this is 14,000 unique movements of traffic on that road.
Okay. Thank you.
All right. Getting close to the end here, but with the agriculture, Alberta's second largest crop producing region. We have 13.6 of all Alberta's cropland is in northwestern Alberta. This is a little harder to track just within our immediate area, but within northwestern Alberta, we have about 14% of all the agricultural land. We've not seen a lot of significant changes in the agricultural industry over the last number of years. We've seen farms get bigger, we've seen genetics get better and yields increase. But as far as industry, we've not seen a lot of changes within the municipal boundaries of Grande Prairie. On the travel side, right now we have 2 new hotels under construction, the 4-Point Sheraton on 68th Avenue, just south of the Eastlink Centre, and a new Podolin Hotel in Centre West on the west side of the city. Hotel occupancy rates year to date are up over last year, about 10% up over the same period last year. And airport passengers are up about 4% year to date. However, just in October alone, they're up closer to 10%, which kind of coincides with new flights that are being added in Grande Prairie as well to keep up with the demand.
Perhaps just on that note, I should point out to Council that for the first time ever, Brian Glavin, as Manager of Economic Development, will be placed on the Airport Commission as a voting member. And that was a very intentional strategy that manifests from the last Council, looking to ensure that we can assert into the Airport Commission the kinds of skill sets and expertise that the city needs in order to properly help to manage that strategic asset. Economic development was considered to be a valuable attribute to insert onto the commission, and that will happen during this term of the commission. So that's underway.
Mr. Glavin.
All right, and to finish it off here, we'll end in forestry. This region produces 40% of Alberta's pulp and 50% of its timber. So it's not necessarily Grande Prairie, but this region within Alberta. Grande Prairie is home to 4 large mills. We have Weyerhaeuser, Canfor, Norbord, and International Paper. If anybody missed it, Weyerhaeuser used to have pulp and solid lumber. They sold their pulp off to International Paper, who now operates that mill. And it employs approximately 3,300 people in our industry, whether directly or indirectly. So it's quite a significant portion of the region's population that works within forestry. And with that, I'll be happy to take any other questions.
Thanks very much, Mr. Glavin. I see Councillor Thiessen.
Thank you very much, Mayor Given. Brian, just touching on the forestry aspect, I think Kevin O'Toole is looking for a more global perspective. But on the local perspective, the changes to the NAFTA agreements and tariffs to softwood lumber, have you had any discussions with Canfor located directly in the city as to what their thoughts or feelings are, or if they're nervous about it, or what their plan is moving forward?
So we have spoken with Canfor. We're in a somewhat fortunate position, or the best of a bad situation, that lumber prices are high right now, so that they're able to absorb some of the tariffs. However, that could change at any time if there was something that dramatically slowed U.S. housing or Canadian housing to a lesser extent. The forestry companies have made a concerted effort over the last number of years to diversify away from the U.S. market. However, it's still a significant portion of their exports and is very material to their outcomes. So I think that we're all hoping that they are able to find some sort of an agreement here with the U.S. Very soon. I know that they're filing a NAFTA challenge right now as we speak. But the short answer to your question is that lumber prices are strong right now, and that is helping them mitigate the increase in tariffs.
Thank you.
Councillor Bressie.
Thank you. I know that North America-wide malls are really struggling. I'm just curious, how's the Prairie Mall doing these days?
Yeah, the Prairie Mall is actually one of the strongest in Morguard's portfolio. Morguard is the company that owns it, and it's performed very well for them over the last number of years, including through the last downturn. So this mall has seen a reinvestment, and obviously the new wing, the former Target side, has leased up the majority of its space with 3 new core tenants in there, and I know that they're close to signing leases with a number of the in the smaller bays. So this mall is not of significant concern. I think in the U.S. they had the big challenge. It was the oversaturation of malls in the U.S. That they're starting to come to terms with there now.
Councillor Palat.
Thanks, Mayor Given. Brian, I'm just wondering with IP, I mean, it was I think that was in the last 12 months or so that took place. I've heard different stories. I'm just kind of wondering if you can maybe give an update of what IP's position of reinvestment in the local mill is. I've heard that they're looking at actually doing a fairly substantial reinvestment in this mill, but I'm not sure if you've heard anything that we could maybe be more quantified.
I don't have anything that would be solidly one way or the other on that this time.
Councillor Thiessen.
Thank you very much, Mayor Given. Brian, just in regards to our retail vacancy spaces, any idea when the new Canadian Tire is going to come online and out on 116th? Obviously, they got to break ground and start building that big sucker, but that's going to leave a big open building at the current Canadian Tire space. So any idea where that's forecasted to be built in this upcoming budget term?
So I can't confirm, obviously, any of their building timelines. That's a corporate decision on their end. However, they have pulled a development permit at this time. To my knowledge, there's no building permit pulled, and until that time, we don't really have a solid indication of when they'll start construction on that.
Okay, thank you.
Mr. Nicolai.
Just if we're starting to finish up with Brian, I just thought I would remind council that this is a very, very strategic part of the city organization. This is where our appetite for commercial development, industrial development, and ultimately residential development manifests very, very clearly for those that are looking at doing business. Many communities in their strategy make statements like we're open for business or we're business friendly or other platitudes like that. One of the things that we will try to focus on as we move into strategic planning in February of this year or February of next year is trying to put some real framework around that so that this council's desire with regard to economic development and stimulating that kind of investment in the community can manifest in some very clear ways so the organization can line up behind that and assert itself properly. Brian has a great handle on the issues in the community right now, and there are areas of discretion. There are areas that we can work in more focused ways, and there are policies that we can pursue that would assist in economic development. We'll get at those during the strategy session as well.
Thanks, Mr. Nicolai. Brian, thanks very much for the presentation. I get a sense that everybody was very interested to get into something that's a little bit more relevant or at least a little bit more focused on the Grande Prairie region. Certainly appreciate that. I was saying to the city manager, I wish the CIBC guys would have stayed for your presentation because they may have given them a little bit more context about what's going on here and how Grande Prairie might be a bit different than the rest of Canada and Alberta. Having said that, we are where our agenda says we would be at lunchtime, a half an hour from now, and appreciating that we can't necessarily make the food arrive sooner unless it already has arrived. I'd look to you, Mr. City Manager, if you'd be interested in doing the introduction to priority-based budgeting, which was scheduled for about a half an hour, and then we should be about noon, and we would sort of move through the agenda a little bit more quickly.
Actually, Mr. Chairman, if it would work for council, I wouldn't mind starting the afternoon session early. It really breaks down into a few pretty discrete pieces, and that'll leave us contiguous on priority-based budgeting. My comments, my introductory comments on priority-based budgeting are very brief, but I'd be prepared to move into the 2018 budget review and start to talk about some of the strategy issues and the 2017 accomplishments and just see where that takes us for 12 o'clock.
So you're suggesting sort of our 3 to 4 o'clock, if I'm looking at our agenda, that's where we'll sort of jump to?
Yes.
Okay, and just so council members are able to follow along in our budget binder that we've received. So starting with summary of the 2015 to 2018 council strategy, summary of the 2015-2017 budget accomplishments. And Mr. City Manager, you're going to lead, you and your team.
Thank you. Yeah, section 6. I was looking at it and it said 9, but I was kind of upside down. So I'll just wait for that to come up on the screen. And maybe just briefly review the agenda beforehand just to keep us on track. The economic forecast is done. The section on introduction to priority-based budgeting it will be right after lunch. What I'll go through right now is the summary of the 2015-18 council strategy. And I know we did a bit of this in the orientation as well, but I thought it was worth recapping it because it drives what happens in the budget. And I wanted to make that direct association. The accomplishments from 2015 to 2017 will review at a high level, but start to show some of the ways in which these strategies manifest. We'll talk about the citizen budget and other analytical and management tools that are put to work even now and that will certainly expand as we move forward through 2018, 19 and beyond. And that'll move us then into the summary of the 2018 budget plan. So that will probably still be this afternoon. We'll talk about the budget shortfalls and how they manifest, the scenario budgeting, a brief discussion on risk. We'll translate anything that we talk about when we get to a budget scenario. We'll be prepared to talk about that in terms of tax implications so that we know what the outcome is to the budgets that council might start to favor. We'll do a fairly thorough review of the capital budget, even at a high level, and then we'll stop on the budget review summary, and that'll allow us to reflect on what we've done in the first day and prepare us to get into a deeper level of detail going forward. So in terms of 2015 to 2018 council strategy, it started with, as I suspect yours will as well, a establishment of council's guiding principles. And these were the ways in which council was going to communicate with the community and certainly with its organization, how we needed to conduct ourselves as we pursue short and long-term business strategies. We talked quite purposely, council talked quite purposely about being proactive and advocating on behalf of our citizens to other levels of government. Guiding principle that affects us even today is the diversity of our economy, talking about focusing on improving the vitality and diversity of our community. So when I talked a little bit earlier about how economic development is a strategic area for us, it really is, and we need to be very clear as to what this council's desires are in terms of attracting economic development to Grande Prairie. A guiding principle was articulated surrounding engaging citizens and being transparent, clear and accurate and timely. And certainly the previous council, and I think this council has now had a chance to start to meet our new manager of strategic communications in that area. We will be focusing very, very clearly on ensuring that we're at the level of citizen engagement that this council feels is appropriate to conduct business. A guiding principle of exceptional service, citizen-centered and customer-focused, is the way in which we've been trying to pursue all of the services that are provided by the City of Grande Prairie. And that manifests in the organizations we put to work, the way in which we run our facilities, the way we finance them and fund them, and the way we hold them accountable. Another guiding principle was family-focused, that the council felt and feels to this day that this needs to be a family-friendly community, and that our services that are provided into Grande Prairie need to reflect our demographics. Often as we try to do comparisons to other municipalities, we have to bear in mind things like the difference in demographics. It's quite easy to look at how many swimming pools are available in a community and compare them across a variety of communities. But if you're not aware that our average age in Grande Prairie might be 10 years younger than the average age in another community, the demand for those kind of facilities may be radically different. It may appear to be an oversupply here, when in fact it isn't an oversupply, it's reflecting the demographics of the community. A guiding principle of being fiscally responsible. You've heard talk about performance-based budgeting. You've heard talk about our base level service reviews and the way in which we hold ourselves accountable and strive to be sustainable. Those are arising from these principles. We would not necessarily be pursuing those kinds of things with that kind of vigor if it weren't for the fact that the guiding principles of this organization lead us into that area. The healthy environment principle, considering the impact of our actions on the environment and leading by example. We have a very robust energy strategy that is being developed even as we speak in the organization. It's not quite ready to go to council for consideration, but by the time it gets to council, you'll start to see some very thoughtful articulation of ideas around the environment and the economy and leading by example. So we feel Grande Prairie can be a world leader in terms of how it approaches the environment, our energy strategy, and the economic advantages that can arise from that energy strategy. These are only occurring because council has provided guiding principles that led us to start dedicating resources in this area. Being informed and making decisions based on reliable evidence. We'll talk about that a little bit when we see an example of a base level review. It's certainly what you'll hear about this afternoon in the presentation on priority-based budgeting. Data-driven decision-making is so important. It's so easy, particularly in the provision of municipal services. It's so easy to form opinions. We talk about transit buses as being empty. People see an empty transit bus rattling around the city. That should be based on real ridership data. You should really know how many people are riding the bus. And that data is available and will be made available to you to make sure that you get a chance to make informed decisions on key issues in the community. Being innovative, I don't need to spend much time on this one because This is probably one of the most innovative communities I've ever encountered. But council set as a principle that this ought to be an incubator of excellence and encourage entrepreneurial thinking and an innovative culture. We certainly do that throughout the community every chance we get. We support organizations like Community Futures, but we do it inside the community as well, or pardon me, inside the organization as well, where we have a very focused effort on on innovation. We meet once a year and rally around the accomplishments of innovation that occur inside the organization. We recognize leaders who have brought forward innovative ideas and reward them and honor them for bringing those forward into the organization. They have resulted in some very, very material changes in how business is conducted in Grande Prairie. And again, we get the wind in our sails to pursue these kinds of initiatives from the guiding principles of City Council. That's a role council plays that management follows very, 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 very closely. Partnerships, we encourage partnerships to get things done and being effective in utilizing collaboration and coordination. I think you will see, if you haven't had a chance to experience it already, how Grande Prairie is a leader in the what has now become the province's mandated intermunicipal collaboration framework initiative. Grande Prairie got out in front of this long before that phrase was coined by the province of Alberta and set this as a guiding principle, which meant that by the time we started to see the province of Alberta mandating intermunicipal collaboration, we were already in a frame of mind that allowed us to move into that very quickly. We quickly engaged a project to start inventorying services that could be provided in a more collaborative way, coordinating with others. We've moved into a mode now. We've set a steering committee. We started working with neighboring communities, and we've started to move into a mode now of setting a strategy to pursue exactly what the province of Alberta is looking to achieve in that ICF framework. So that was a guiding principle that started to form the culture of this organization and allowed us to move very quickly when we started to see opportunities. And the last one is one that I'm still getting used to, having moved here recently from Texas, but flexible in adapting our policies and guidelines to be reflective of the northern climate. And I would even add to that the northern culture. It is really a different culture with a different set of values that manifests in this part of the world, and ensuring that what we do and the programs that we provide and the facilities we operate and the way in which we look after roads and streets and pathways is reflective of an active community living in a northern climate. So that's really all I'll say on guiding principles, and I'm sorry in advance if I beat this drum too loud, but when we get into strategy sessions, that's how important these kinds of documents are as we look to administer the day-to-day operations of the municipal corporation. Those guiding principles then led to 4 primary areas of strategy that were articulated by City Council. And these 2 have very profound impact on how the organization operates. They were broken into what are referred to as focus areas during this planning cycle. This council in its planning cycle might choose different vocabulary, but likely getting at the same kinds of themes. One of the focus areas was optimizing existing services, where we talk about providing well-integrated services that efficiently and effectively maximize the use of our resources. We talk about continually refining how we provide those services and striving for best practices. So when you hear us talking about lean business process improvement and Six Sigma operations, those are classic techniques that are designed to do exactly that, to look at how we can continuously improve the performance of this organization as it serves this community. That focus area gave rise to council strategic directions, exploring opportunities to partner, which we've talked about a little bit earlier, a very active initiative that's underway in the organization, and in fact a part of our corporate culture. Partnering with community groups, we'll look at doing perhaps more of that even as time goes on, exploring issues around affordability and enhancing tourism. So that was a focus area of council that came out of the strategic planning exercise that has given rise to what you will see in this budget, and certainly what councils have seen in the budgets previous to this one. The second focus area was what was referred to as strengthening our core. And, you know, this is very timely right now because it was about strengthening a vibrant urban core that meets the needs of residents and visitors. And it even went on to suggest that we needed an all-season, multi-purpose neighborhood, our downtown, as a defining element of the city. So we're talking about already the conclusion of phase 1 and phase 2 of the major capital project that has occurred in our downtown area. Phase 3 and phase 4 will be up for discussion as part of these deliberation. That initiative would have gotten its legs. Its genesis of that kind of initiative would have been born in the strategy that talked about strengthening our core. It gave rise to strategic directions like developing a vision and a plan for an energetic downtown. There is a belief articulated through the strategy that we're working under that an energetic downtown, a vibrant downtown, is important to this community. Enhancing community mobility, promoting residential development in the downtown area, and exploring alternative models of land development all got their genesis in a strategy statement that identified a focus area surrounding strengthening our core. A third focus area is what was referred to as exploring new directions. And this is perhaps the innovative and creative side of the community starting to show through, where council clearly articulated a vision in their preferred future of an innovative center of excellence and a hub for business incubation. Continually, again, seeking out best practices, willing to take risks in order to find solutions that serve the community, and maximizing the use of land through creative and strategic designs. So you can see how a statement like that, a focus area like that, will permeate virtually every area that we bring resources to bear within the city organization. It gave rise to strategic directions such as exploring alternative governance models, which is very active right now, exploring best practices, balancing residential and non-residential development. That's a constant tension in the development community as we look at demand for each of those products, and developing residential infill strategies that make optimal use of land. The final area of focus that came out of council strategic deliberations that has given us our legs right now is what's referred to as capitalizing on growth. This was being adaptable, or this was identified as a need for Grande Prairie to be adaptable to growth and change, taking advantage of trends and building on current momentum to attract developments. So when we talked about Brian needing, or economic development needing, a clear signal from council as to what he should be doing, what kind of a strategy ought to be executed in his day-to-day activities, that's where he gets that kind of activity, or that's where he gets that kind of direction. It manifests in strategic directions such as ensuring planning considers full spectrum of services provided by the city, best use of models to take advantage of industry trends, investing in infrastructure to meet burgeoning demand and future needs. So not just building for today, but building for the anticipated future needs into the future. And strengthening the depth and length of our planning documents to make sure that we get clarity in the community as to what planning and development desires and what the hoops are that need to be jumped in order to get there. So that's a synthesis of the strategy that occurred in the council that was before this council, that gave us our marching orders, gave the organization its marching orders, allowed us to dispatch our people and our financial resources in order to start achieving objectives within the community. And I thought I'd just take a moment and go through some of those. I won't read through all of these. You have them in your package. But when we relate them back to the focus area, you get a chance to see just how powerful strategy is in the execution of the day-to-day operations of this corporation. On the focus area of optimizing existing services, we see an intermunicipal collaboration framework that's very much alive and being worked on today. We see affordable housing initiatives, regional transportation priorities, a police funding framework that has become a major tenet of our advocacy program going forward, etc. And these were, from an operating budget perspective and a capital budget perspective, these were initiatives that get their mandate from the strategy that's set by City Council. On the focus area, strengthening our core, as I mentioned earlier, this is where the downtown rehabilitation project came from, phases 1 and 2, and it's why phases 3 and 4 are in front of you today. We're still operating under a strategy that says strengthening our core is important to this community. The Mamawee Concourse at the Montrose Centre arose from this focus area. Purchasing of fuel-efficient buses and the infill and facade improvement programs in downtown came about as a result of this particular focus area. In the focus area of exploring new directions, again, the municipal collaboration framework, we often see accomplishments and initiatives blending between many focus areas in strategy. That's not uncommon at all. The Safe Roads project that Horacio will describe in his presentation a little further on and will be shown to you in much more detail in December. I believe we have a scheduled review in front of City Council as to what has been accomplished in the Safe Roads project in Grande Prairie. It's really quite remarkable, and it gets its genesis from the fact that we set that as a strategy in Grande Prairie and asked administration to go out and execute against it. The transit solar charging station and the electric buses is another good example of that. Those are new directions that are being pursued by this organization as a leader in trying to provide a sustainable future for Grande Prairie. And the final focus area that was capitalizing on growth saw major accomplishments, and this is just the 3-year period. So the strategy would have been set for 2015 to 2018 inclusive. The accomplishments that we're able to articulate here are things that City Council accomplished during the 3 years that have already been more or less completed. The 2016 annexation was a huge one in terms of capitalizing on growth. Major impact on the size of Grande Prairie. Infrastructure initiatives like twinning major streets and avenues so that we get 21st century infrastructure to move traffic through Grande Prairie was capitalizing on growth. And something we now refer to as the Tri-Municipal Industrial Group or Industrial Partnership is something that we have been pursuing now for several months with the County of Grande Prairie and the MD of Greenview, which is a very innovative way of revenue sharing, and perhaps even more important than revenue sharing, having 3 levels of government shoulder up and work on a common initiative that will impact this entire region. That comes about because we had a set of marching orders from Council that talked about capitalizing on growth. Mr. Chairman, we're now 10 minutes to when lunch would arrive, and now I would be getting into the 2017 budget and leveraging that into 2018. We could stop and pause for questions, and if there are no questions, move into a check your email break if Council would like to do that.
Sure. So I'll just look to my Council colleagues. Are there any questions at this point on what Bob has presented? No, and if not, I just wanted to, show some appreciation for making that direct connection between the importance of Council setting strategic directions and the outcomes that the organization delivers for the community. Appreciate making that connection and really highlighting the opportunity that this Council has as we go into our strategic planning come the new year. If there are no questions, I do see that lunch is arriving. Should we say that we will break for lunch now? And come back 15 minutes early so we can keep the day sort of progressing. Okay. Sure. Is everybody sort of looking around to see if there's sort of consensual head nods there? Is everybody okay with that? So we will break now and we'll be back at 1:45. So there's a question of whether we're working through lunch, and at minimum we're going to need to sort of fill our plates and everybody get sort of assembled, and it will be challenging for administration to be presenting while they have forks in hand. So let's take a break, assemble lunch, and we'll see when we can come back. I'm not so worried about if there's anybody that tunes in and we're already in progress, then maybe that's just the way it goes. It is being recorded, and so will be saved online if anybody wanted to view it. So we'll take our break.
Yeah, we will break for lunch today. It'll be easier for us to move or work through lunch certainly on the 3rd day and perhaps even on the 2nd day.
Yeah. Okay. So we'll come back at 1:45. Thank you.